A year came when darkness spread across the world in ways few people could have imagined. Cities lost power, crops failed, temperatures dropped. Entire societies struggled to understand what was happening as the sky itself seemed to change. But what if one forgotten year nearly pushed civilization to the edge? What if the world truly went dark? Tonight we uncover the astonishing story of the year that changed human history forever, a time of fear, survival, and mystery that scientists are still studying today. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and join us for more journeys into history's greatest mysteries. This is the year the world went dark. A grey light lies over the fields, thin as ash and cold, enough to make summer feel uncertain. The sun is there, but it does not behave like the sun people know. It hangs behind a strange veil, weakened, flattened, almost colourless, giving light without strength. Across parts of the ancient world, farmers look upward and then back down at soil that should be warming beneath their feet. Seeds wait in the ground, shoots rise slowly, fruit refuses to ripen. In villages, men and women measure time by habit, by planting, by saints' days, by imperial calendars, by the movements of animals and birds, but the sky has begun to ignore the old rhythm. What should be a season of growth becomes a season of doubt. The year will later be remembered in scattered records and buried evidence as one of the strangest years in human history, a year when the world seems to go dark. The date most often attached to this mystery is 536 in the late antique world, when the Roman Empire still exists in the East, when Constantinople stands as one of the great cities of the Mediterranean, when Persia watches from beyond the imperial frontier, when kingdoms rise and fall across Europe, and when distant courts in China keep their own careful accounts of weather famine and celestial disorder. No one living through it can see the whole pattern. A farmer in Ireland does not know what an official in Constantinople has heard. A Chinese chronicler does not know what ice will preserve on a distant frozen sheet. A monk recording hunger does not know that many centuries later scientists will drill into glaciers and read that same darkness as chemistry. The world is connected, but not connected enough for people to understand a planet-wide disturbance as it unfolds. They experience it locally, bodily, fearfully as cold, failed harvests dim skies, and a sun that seems to have lost its authority. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. This story is not a tale of a single ruined city or one vanished kingdom. It is larger and stranger than that. It is a story about how thin the boundary can be between ordinary life and disaster, and how a change high in the atmosphere can reach into bread ovens, tax records, graveyards, trade routes, royal courts, and family memories. The darkness of 536 is not darkness in the simple sense of night. It is something more unsettling, daylight made unreliable. The records that survive do not describe a world plunged into complete blackness. They describe a sun obscured for months, an atmosphere thickened by something people cannot name, a cooling that lingers and harvests that falter across wide regions. What survives in the record suggests not one dramatic instant, but a slow atmospheric injury, a dulling of the world that presses on human life day after day. The people who witness it live in a world already carrying strain. Empires are expensive to hold together. Armies require grain animals, roads, ships, and money. Cities depend on countryside they do not control directly, and countryside depends on weather that no ruler can command. The Mediterranean world is full of movement merchants with oil and wine, officials with orders, bishops with letters, soldiers with pay demands, refugees with rumours, and ships moving through sea lanes that carry goods, people, and disease. Beyond the Mediterranean societies across Europe and Asia, follow their own seasonal balances. In the north, shorter growing seasons make even small climate disruptions dangerous. In the steppe, pasture and herd health shape power. In China, where court historians often pay close attention to unusual weather and signs in the sky cold summers, and crop failures can become part of political memory. The world before the darkness is not primitive, but it is vulnerable in ways modern people sometimes underestimate. It has skill, knowledge, trade law and engineering, but it also depends almost completely on the regular return of warmth. Then the sky changes. Ancient observers do not use modern atmospheric language. They do not speak of aerosol loading sulfate layers, volcanic stratospheric injection, or radiative forcing. They describe what the eye sees and what the body feels. The sun gives light without brightness. Shadows weaken. Summer loses force. Some accounts from the period and shortly after it speak of a dimmed sun lasting for many months. And although scholars still debate how each text should be read, the broader pattern is difficult to ignore. A strange haze appears to have spread through the atmosphere, scattering or blocking sunlight, enough to disturb climate across much of the northern hemisphere. The evidence remains incomplete, and not every region suffers in the same way, but the surviving traces point toward a major atmospheric event beginning around 536, followed by years of instability. For ordinary people, the first sign may not be fear of cosmic disaster. It may be practical confusion. Grain grows too slowly, rain comes at the wrong time, or cold holds too long. Trees respond in narrow rings, though no one yet has the tools to read them. Animals find less reliable pasture. Stored food becomes more precious. A poor harvest is never merely a bad season. It changes marriage plans, rents, taxes, travel, illness, birth and burial. In a village, one failed crop can be endured if the storehouses are strong and neighbours have surplus. Repeated failures are different. They turn caution into hunger, and hunger into movement. People sell tools, slaughter breeding animals, abandon marginal land, or crowd toward places where they believe food still exists. The sky's dimness becomes social pressure. It creeps into markets and monasteries, into soldiers' rations and peasant debts, into the quiet calculations of whether a family can survive until the next harvest. The most haunting part of 536 is not that people notice something strange. It is that they cannot know why. A dim sun can be read as omen, divine warning, celestial disorder, or simply terrifying weather. In societies where the heavens are often tied to meaning, an altered sky does not remain a physical event. It becomes moral, political, and spiritual. Rulers may be judged under it. Wars may seem cursed by it. Famines may appear as punishment. Yet beneath those interpretations lies a material reality that does not care how people explain it. Plants need light. Bodies need food. States need revenue. Armies need supplies. When the atmosphere changes, belief and administration both collide with the same cold fields. Modern science gives the year a different kind of voice. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica preserve chemical signs that point toward major volcanic activity in the mid-6th century. Tree rings from different parts of the northern hemisphere show abrupt cooling with growth narrowed in ways that match environmental stress. No single piece of evidence tells the whole story, and no single explanation fully accounts for every regional experience, but together they create a chilling picture. Something immense appears to have placed reflective particles high in the atmosphere, likely from a powerful volcanic eruption, perhaps followed by additional eruptions that prolong the damage. The exact source remains debated. Candidates have been proposed in different volcanic regions, and the scientific argument continues because the planet keeps its secrets unevenly. Ash travels. Ice preserves some signals and not others. Texts survive by chance. Trees record climate but not human fear. To call this year the year the world went dark is partly poetic, but only partly. It captures the shock of a civilization that looks up and finds the most dependable object in daily life transformed. The sun is not gone, but it is diminished. The world continues, but less securely. People still wake, work, pray, trade, argue, and bury their dead. Officials still write, ships still sail. Children are still born beneath the strange pale sky. History does not stop when disaster begins. It becomes harder, thinner, more fragile. That is why 536 has such power in the imagination and such importance in research. It reveals a past in which human societies are not simply shaped by kings and battles, but by particles too small to see drifting high above the clouds. The darkness begins as atmosphere, but it does not stay there. It enters the ground as cold. It enters the harvest as scarcity. It enters memory as dread. In time it will connect with famine, migration, political weakness and disease, though carefully, because the evidence must not be forced into a single neat chain. Scholars still debate how far the consequences reached, and how directly one disaster caused another. Yet the opening scene remains stark enough, a weakened sun over a world that depends on warmth, a year that feels wrong from the sky downward, and human beings trying to continue under a light they no longer trust. Before the darkened sky becomes a crisis, the world beneath it is already complicated, crowded with ambition, movement, and fragile order. The middle of the 6th century is not an empty stage waiting for catastrophe. It is a living world of ports, farms, courts, monasteries, caravan roads, mountain villages, frontier forts and river settlements, all held together by patterns that seem stable until weather begins to break them. In the east, the Roman Empire survives as a powerful Mediterranean state, ruled from Constantinople, a city of walls, harbours, churches, markets, palaces, and administrative memory. Its rulers still imagine themselves as heirs to Rome, not as a remnant, but as the continuation of imperial civilization itself. Laws are written, taxes are collected, soldiers are dispatched, and ships cross the sea with grain oil, wine timber, cloth, metalwork, and news. The empire has endured crises before. It has survived invasions, rebellions, religious disputes, and economic pressure. Yet survival can create its own illusion. A state that has endured much may begin to appear stronger than the systems that feed it. The countryside is the foundation of everything. Cities can appear dominant because they leave stone inscriptions, coins, monuments, and chronicles. But it is the field that decides whether the city can breathe. Wheat, barley, vines, olives, legumes, orchards, pasture, and stored grain form the quiet machinery behind imperial power. The army does not march on glory. It marches on flour fodder, transport animals, and pay. A palace does not function on ceremony alone. It depends on taxes measured ultimately against land harvest, labour, and trade. Even religion with all its spiritual authority rests partly on material foundations, estates, offerings, land donations, stored goods, and the ability of communities to support clergy, buildings, and charity. In years of normal weather, these foundations can appear ordinary. In years of bad weather, they reveal themselves as the true architecture of civilization. Across the Mediterranean, daily life follows a rhythm shaped by seasons more than by rulers. Farmers watch winter rain, spring warmth, summer dryness, and autumn storage with attention sharpened by necessity. In a good year, the landscape itself seems to cooperate with human expectation. Grain ripens in fields that shimmer under heat. Grapes swell on vines. Olives prepare for pressing. Animals graze on familiar roots. Mills turn. Bakers work before dawn. Market stalls fill with goods whose arrival depends on hundreds of small successful acts no chronicler bothers to record. In a bad year, that invisible chain begins to fail. A cold spring can matter, a wet harvest can matter, a dim summer can matter. Food systems in the late antique world are not helpless, but they are not infinitely elastic. Storage helps, trade helps, wealth helps, but none of them can fully replace sunlight across wide regions for long. The Roman world is also expanding its ambitions under Emperor Justinian. His reign is marked by enormous projects, legal reform, religious politics, building programs, military campaigns, and attempts to restore imperial control in the Western Mediterranean. North Africa has been taken from the Vandals. War in Italy is underway or soon deepens into a long destructive struggle. The eastern frontier with Persia remains tense and expensive. Constantinople itself rises with monumental confidence, especially through churches and public works that express sacred and imperial authority together. To later eyes, this can look like a golden age of late Roman energy. Yet beneath the surface, ambition stretches supply. Armies cost money. Campaigns disrupt regions. Taxation presses on landowners and peasants. Rebuilding consumes resources. Victory in one place can become exhaustion in another. What survives in the record suggests a state capable of remarkable organization, but also one increasingly exposed to shocks it cannot fully command. Beyond imperial borders, the world is equally dynamic. In Western Europe, post-Roman kingdoms are forming identities from a mixture of Roman inheritance, local power, military leadership, Christian institutions, and older social structures. The Franks expand in Gaul. Gothic rule persists in Italy and Spain in different forms. Britain is fragmented with shifting powers and sparse written evidence. Ireland preserves monastic and annalistic traditions that later become important for understanding famine years, though those records must be handled carefully because copying chronology and interpretation can complicate the picture. In Scandinavia and the Baltic regions, communities depend on farming, animal husbandry, seafaring exchange, and elite networks expressed through halls, graves, weapons, ornaments, and ritual landscapes. These northern societies are especially sensitive to shorter growing seasons. A loss of warmth there is not merely uncomfortable. It can push marginal communities toward abandonment, conflict, or reorganization. Farther east, the Sasanian Persian Empire stands as Rome's great rival, sophisticated, wealthy, militarized, and deeply rooted in its own administrative and religious traditions. Between Rome and Persia lie contested zones, where fortresses, cities, tribes, merchants, and diplomats live under the shadow of larger powers. War here is not constant in every place, but the possibility of war shapes roads, taxes, loyalties, and fear. To the north and east, steppe peoples move across immense landscapes where climate can alter pasture and mobility. In Central Asia, trade routes link regions unevenly, but meaningfully carrying silk metals, horses, ideas, religions, and pathogens. No single explanation fully accounts for the transformations of these regions, but environmental stress can interact with politics in ways that later narratives simplify into invasion, collapse, or sudden migration. China too is divided and politically complex in this era. The 6th century is a time before reunification under the Sui, with northern and southern regimes maintaining courts, armies, rituals, and written records. Chinese historical traditions often preserve observations of unusual weather, frosts, snowfalls, crop failures, famines, and celestial phenomena. These records are not modern meteorological data, and scholars still debate how to interpret particular entries, but they matter. because they show that climate stress was not merely a Mediterranean story. When cold drought, snow, or hunger appears in distant records around the same broad period, the possibility of a wider atmospheric disturbance becomes harder to dismiss. The ancient world does not know itself as a single connected climate system, yet the air above it is shared. Trade makes this world more resilient and more vulnerable at the same time. A city that imports grain can survive local shortage if shipping routes remain open and surplus exists elsewhere. A merchant network can move goods around regional failures, but connection also spreads pressure. If several regions struggle at once, the network cannot simply invent abundance. Prices rise, ships carry less or arrive late. Officials requisition supplies, local resentment grows. Ports that seem prosperous in normal years can become choke points under stress. And where people move in search of food safety work or military opportunity, they also carry rumours, obligations, debts, and sometimes disease. The same roads that bind civilization together can transmit its weaknesses. The world before the darkness is therefore not balanced on one fragile thread, but on many threads tied together. That makes it strong in some ways and vulnerable in others. A single poor harvest in one province can be absorbed. A war in one region can be financed by another. A city can rebuild after fire. A frontier can shift and still leave the larger world intact. But when the sky itself changes, when cold and dimness begin to affect multiple regions, the ordinary buffers weaken. Surplus becomes uncertain. Charity becomes strained. Tax demands become harsher because rulers rarely need less money in a crisis. Armies still require food. Cities still expect supply. The poor still eat first from the edge of scarcity and suffer first when that edge sharpens. What is striking about the year 536 is not that it attacks a simple world. It attacks a world of systems. The darkness falls on an age of administrative sophistication, religious intensity, military ambition, and economic movement. It falls on people who have explanations for suffering, but not the instruments to measure stratospheric dust. It falls on states that can command labour, but cannot command weather. It falls on fields whose growth depends on a solar rhythm older than any empire. The coming veil across the sky will not erase all of this at once. It will reveal how much of civilization rests on the assumption that the next season will behave enough like the last. The veil does not arrive like a storm people can watch crossing the horizon. There is no single wall of cloud, no thunderhead rolling over the fields, no familiar sign that would let farmers say the weather has turned and will soon pass. It is stranger because it seems to belong to the whole sky. Day after day the sun appears weakened as though something has been placed between the earth and heaven, not close enough to touch, not visible enough to name, but powerful enough to drain warmth from the season. People still see daylight. They still walk to fields, markets, churches, wells, riverbanks, workshops, and palace offices. Yet the light has changed its character. It no longer carries the same authority. It is pale, thin, and unreliable, the kind of daylight that makes shadows uncertain and makes the body wait for warmth that never fully comes. For ancient observers, this kind of sky is difficult to describe because it is not simply bad weather. Clouds are familiar. Fog is familiar. Dust near the ground is familiar. Smoke from fire is familiar. Eclipses are terrifying but brief, and they follow a different rhythm. The dimming of 536 appears to have lasted far too long to fit ordinary categories. Later writers describe the sun as giving light without brightness, and although every surviving account must be read with caution, the image is unforgettable because it captures something physically plausible and emotionally disturbing. The sun is present but diminished. The world is not dark in the way night is dark. It is dim in the way a lamp is dimmed by a dirty covering, still glowing, still visible but robbed of force. In Constantinople and across the Eastern Roman world, such a sky would have carried more than meteorological meaning. The 6th century is deeply religious, and signs in the heavens are not treated as neutral curiosities. The heavens are part of the moral imagination of society. A strange sun can become a warning, a judgment, an omen, or a sign that the order of the world has shifted. Court officials, clergy, soldiers, merchants, and common labourers may not agree on the exact meaning, but they share the unease of living beneath a sky that seems altered. Even those with practical minds cannot ignore the problem. The empire's calendars, tax cycles, agricultural expectations, and religious observances all assume the regular movement of seasons. When light and warmth fail, meaning and administration begin to tremble together, the atmosphere itself remains invisible to them as a system. No one can imagine particles injected into the stratosphere by a distant eruption, spreading around the hemisphere, reflecting sunlight back into space, and cooling land far from the source. No one can test sulfate levels in ice or compare tree rings across continents. The ancient eye sees only the result: an odd haze, a dull sun, unseasonable cold, and crops that seem to hesitate. What survives in the record suggests that the phenomenon is long enough and widespread enough to be remembered, but not uniform enough to be simple. Some places may experience cold, others may experience drought, excessive rainfrost, or strange seasonal timing. A global disturbance does not produce identical local disasters. It bends regional weather through existing landscapes, winds, oceans, mountains, soils, and human systems. This is part of what makes the mystery difficult. A modern audience often wants one clean image: the world goes dark, the temperature drops, and civilization collapses. The actual past is less tidy and more haunting. The veil across the sky is a beginning, not a complete explanation. It does not strike every village with the same severity. It does not erase every harvest everywhere. It does not end empires overnight. Instead, it alters probabilities. It shortens growing seasons in vulnerable regions. It increases the chance of crop failure. It weakens resilience where war, taxation, poverty, or political tension already exist. It turns ordinary hardship into something sharper. It makes the margin between enough and not enough harder to defend. In places where the growing season is already short, the effect can be brutal. A slightly cooler summer may mean grain ripens late or not at all. A late frost may kill young plants. Livestock may enter winter underfed. Hay may be poor. Seed grain may be consumed because hunger leaves no better choice. In warmer regions, the problem may appear differently through disrupted rainfall, poor fruiting disease in crops, or unexpected cold that damages plants adapted to stable seasonal patterns. Farmers in different lands may not describe the same symptoms, but they confront the same deeper uncertainty. The old knowledge is failing. Generations of observation teach when to sow, when to prune, when to move animals, when to harvest, when to store. A dimmed sun makes inherited timing less trustworthy. The human eye is especially sensitive to changes in light because light structures daily life. Before mechanical clocks dominate ordinary experience, the quality of daylight helps organize labor and expectation. Dawn, noon, and evening are not just times, they are sensations. The angle and strength of the sun tell bodies where they are in the day and in the year. A pale sun in a season that should be bright creates a quiet dislocation. Workers may feel that morning never fully becomes day. Houses remain cooler, dampness lingers. Smoke from hearths may seem heavier. Clothes dry slowly. The world becomes less crisp. This kind of change rarely appears in official records, but it shapes memory. Disaster is not only famine counted in annals, it is also the feeling of living through weeks when the air itself seems wrong. The sky's strangeness also invites rumour. News in the 6th century moves by ship-road messenger, pilgrim soldier, trader monk, diplomat and refugee. It changes as it travels. A poor harvest in one region becomes a warning in another. A strange sun seen in one city becomes a sign repeated in distant conversation. People do not need newspapers to create a shared sense of dread. They need only movement and fear. Ports are especially powerful rumour engines. Sailors bring stories from other coasts. Merchants compare prices and shortages. Officials hear reports from provinces. Clergy receive letters from religious networks. A dim sky above one city might be frightening, but reports that the same dimness appears elsewhere make the event feel larger, perhaps cosmic. Still, the surviving written evidence is uneven. Some chroniclers write close to events, others preserve traditions later. Some accounts are brief, some are shaped by religious interpretation. Some may compress events or attach them to dates with imperfect precision. Scholars still debate the details and the evidence remains incomplete. Yet when ancient testimony is placed beside natural archives, the pattern strengthens. Tree rings show environmental stress around this period. Ice cores preserve chemical signs consistent with major volcanic activity. Historical records describe unusual atmospheric and climatic conditions. Each source has limitations, but together they suggest that the veil was not merely metaphor. Something real appears to have altered the sky. The most likely mechanism is volcanic. A powerful eruption can send sulfur gases high into the atmosphere, where they transform into tiny sulfate aerosols. These particles can spread widely and reflect sunlight, producing cooler temperatures at the surface. If the eruption is large enough and if material reaches the stratosphere, the effects can extend far beyond the volcano itself. People near the source may experience ashfall darkness, noise, or local destruction, but people thousands of miles away may experience only a strange sun and failed warmth. That distance is crucial. A society can suffer the consequences of an event it never sees. The cause can be hidden by geography, by atmosphere, and by time. In 536, the source remains uncertain. Some scientific work has pointed toward a high-latitude eruption, perhaps in the northern hemisphere, while other research continues to test possible volcanic candidates. There is also evidence for additional volcanic events in the years that follow, making the mid-6th century crisis a layered disturbance rather than a single atmospheric wound. No single explanation fully accounts for every detail, and the search for the exact volcano is part of the continuing mystery. But the broad outline is grimly clear. The sky was changed by material lifted far above ordinary weather, and human societies below had no way to understand the scale of what had happened. So the veil across the sky becomes the first great character in the story. It is silent, diffuse, and almost impossible for ancient people to confront directly. Armies cannot fight it. Emperors cannot negotiate with it. Priests can interpret it, but interpretation does not restore sunlight. Farmers can adjust, but only within limits. The dimness hangs over a world that still expects the seasons to keep their promises. Beneath that weakened sun, the first consequences begin to move from atmosphere into soil, from soil into harvest, and from harvest into hunger. Cold enters history quietly at first. It does not always arrive as a dramatic frost that whitens every field in a single night. Sometimes it comes as a delay, a thin hesitation in the soil, a spring that refuses to soften a summer that never quite becomes summer. In the years around the darkened sky, this is where the mystery becomes painfully human. A pale sun is frightening, but a pale sun can still be watched with awe. Failed grain is different. Failed grain is counted by hand, by sack, by mouth, by the shrinking space between one meal and the next. The veil across the sky becomes real when the fields stop answering. For most people living in the 6th century, survival depends on harvest close enough to touch. Even in regions tied to trade, food begins in soil rain, warmth seed, animal labour and human endurance. Grain is not just one crop among many. It is bread, porridge, tax, rent, wages, army supply, charity, religious offering, and political stability pressed into a single form. A harvest that falls short does not remain a village problem. It moves outward through obligation. Tenants owe landowners. Landowners owe officials. Officials owe the state. The state owes soldiers. Cities expect shipments. Monasteries and churches expect offerings and also carry the burden of feeding the poor. When ordinary households begin to fail, one weak season can strain this chain. A sequence of weak seasons can pull it apart. The cooling associated with the mid-6th century atmospheric disturbance appears to have struck the northern hemisphere especially hard, though not evenly. Tree rings from many regions suggest that growth narrowed sharply, a biological sign that trees were living through stress. Trees do not record fear, but they record conditions. A narrow ring is a kind of silence in wood, a physical memory of cold drought, short growing seasons, or other limits on growth. When many trees across distant regions show stress in the same broad period, the pattern becomes difficult to dismiss. What survives in the natural record suggests that the dim sky was not merely a strange visual event. It had teeth. It touched living systems. In fields, the consequences would have depended on crop region, altitude, soil, and timing. Wheat and barley can tolerate some hardship, but they still need enough warmth and light to develop properly. Vines are sensitive to seasonal rhythm. Olives prefer stability and warmth. Fruit trees can be damaged by frost at the wrong moment. Legumes may fail if wet, cold, or drought disrupts growth. Pasture can weaken, leaving animals thin before winter. Hay cut too late or grown poorly affects livestock months after the initial weather problem. A bad season therefore multiplies itself. Less grain means less bread. Poor pasture means weaker animals. Weaker animals mean less ploughing power, less manure, fewer offspring and less resilience for the next year. Hunger is rarely a single event. It is a system losing depth. The poorest feel it first because they have the least distance between harvest and hunger. Wealthier households may hold stores, animals, valuables, and claims on other people's labour. Cities may draw food from wider regions. Armies may be supplied by force. Officials may continue collecting taxes even when the countryside weakens, because governments in crisis often become more demanding, not less. But poor families live close to the edge. They can reduce portions, gather wild foods, borrow, sell possessions, send members away for work, delay obligations, or seek aid from religious institutions. Each option carries cost. Selling a tool may buy food but damage future work. Eating seed grain may preserve life but threaten the next planting. Slaughtering breeding animals may provide meat now but reduce future herds. The arithmetic of survival becomes cruel because every answer borrows from tomorrow. Ancient famine is not always visible in the ways modern observers expect. It does not require streets filled with bodies in every place. It can appear as smaller loaves, thinner children, abandoned plots, rising prices, delayed marriages, fewer surviving infants, more theft, more debt, and the quiet movement of people away from land that can no longer support them. It can appear in monasteries overwhelmed by need, in landlords pressing harder in officials, recording shortages with formal restraint in graves that become harder to interpret centuries later. The evidence remains incomplete because hunger often leaves indirect traces. Chroniclers may mention famine only briefly. Archaeology may reveal settlement shifts without preserving the suffering that caused them. Human bones may show stress, but not always with the date sharp enough to name one year. Much of famine passes through history like breath in cold air, visible for a moment and gone. In the mid-6th century, scattered written records point toward hardship in several regions. Irish annals later preserve notices of bread failure or famine around this era, though their chronology and transmission require care. Chinese sources record unusual cold frost snow or crop difficulties in certain years depending on region and text. Mediterranean writers describe the dim sun and troubled conditions. Each account stands inside its own tradition, shaped by local concerns copying histories and interpretation. Scholars still debate how to line them up precisely. Yet the broad convergence with tree rings and ice evidence makes the food crisis plausible in a wider climatic frame. The year 536 is not simply remembered because people were frightened by the sky. It matters because the sky's change appears to have entered the food supply. One lesser-known detail is that cold can be devastating even without spectacular winter scenes. A summer only a few degrees cooler than expected can ruin crops at high latitudes or higher elevations. Grain may grow but fail to mature fully. Harvest may be delayed until rain damages it. Damp conditions can encourage rot. People may still see green fields and yet face poor yields. This makes the disaster psychologically strange. The landscape may not always look dead. It may look unfinished, delayed, disappointing, as though the year has lost momentum. Farmers understand this kind of danger better than chroniclers do. A field that almost succeeds can be as heartbreaking as a field destroyed outright, because it has consumed labour while returning too little. Empty granaries are also political spaces. Grain storage gives rulers and elites power, because stored food can be redistributed, sold, guarded, taxed, or seized. In cities, public order often depends on the perception that food will continue to arrive. A shortage in the countryside becomes unrest in the town when prices climb beyond reach. Bread is never only bread in an urban society. It is a measure of legitimacy. People may tolerate distant wars, theological disputes and court politics more easily than a market where the poor cannot buy enough to eat. In Constantinople, a city accustomed to large-scale supply, the logistics of grain are tied to imperial authority itself. Even when the capital is buffered better than many places, the idea of scarcity carries danger. Rural communities may respond with both cooperation and conflict. Neighbours can share labour pool resources and rely on kin networks. Churches and monasteries can provide relief where they have stores. Local elites may gain prestige by generosity or resentment by hoarding. But hardship can also sharpen suspicion. Strangers seeking food may be feared. Boundaries matter more. Theft becomes more tempting and more harshly punished. Debts become traps. People who once lived in a stable relationship with land may find themselves dependent on patrons, creditors, or distant authorities. The cold field therefore changes social relations. It reveals who has reserves and who has none. It turns weather into hierarchy. The crisis is especially dangerous because it does not occur in a world at peace with itself. War taxation and political ambition are already drawing resources into imperial projects. In some areas, conflict damages fields directly. Armies consume food, requisition animals, trample crops, and disrupt transport. Even the movement of troops creates pressure on local supply. If harvests fail at the same time, the burden intensifies. A ruler may see the crisis as a logistical problem. A farmer sees it as the disappearance of safety. A soldier sees it as ration anxiety. A merchant sees price and risk. A hungry family sees only the shrinking store and the long distance to the next harvest. No single explanation fully accounts for every famine notice or every regional hardship in the years after 536. Some shortages may have local causes. Some records may reflect later memory. Some communities may have escaped the worst, but the larger pattern remains grim. A dimmed atmosphere reduces warmth, reduced warmth, strains, crops strained, crops weaken, storage weakened, storage exposes people. The world does not need to end for disaster to be profound. It only needs the dependable cycle of growth to fail across enough places at once. Under the pale sun, granaries become clocks. Every opened sack measures time. Every handful of grain removed from storage brings a household closer to decision. The sky may be vast and mysterious, but hunger is intimate. It sits at the hearth. It changes the weight of a loaf. It makes parents calculate portions in silence. It makes rulers fear unrest and peasants fear winter. The year the world went dark is remembered not because the sun vanished, but because its weakening travelled downward into the most basic promise of civilization, that the earth worked with skill and patience will give back enough to live. The darkness of 536 survives because people in distant lands leave behind fragments that do not quite belong to ordinary weather. None of these witnesses sees the whole event. None stands above the planet tracing haze through the upper atmosphere or comparing crop failures across continents. They write from inside their own worlds with their own fears, calendars, religious meanings, political loyalties, and limits of knowledge. Yet their scattered observations matter because they form a kind of broken mirror. One shard reflects a dim sun in the Mediterranean. Another reflects hunger in Ireland. Another preserves cold and strange weather in East Asia. Another appears later in natural archives that no ancient person knows how to read. The mystery becomes stronger not because any single source explains everything, but because different kinds of evidence seem to lean toward the same shadow. In the Eastern Roman world, one of the most famous descriptions comes from the historian Procopius, who writes of a sun that gives light without brightness during the reign of Justinian. His account is brief, but it has become central because it captures the unsettling quality of the event. The sun is not absent, it is wrong. Procopius is not writing a weather diary for modern scientists. He is a historian shaped by war politics, imperial ambition, and the literary habits of his age. His words have to be handled with caution, as all ancient testimony does. Still, the detail stands out because it is oddly specific. It does not sound like a passing storm. It suggests a prolonged atmospheric dimming something that makes daylight itself seem weakened. What survives in his record is not a measurement but an impression strong enough to be preserved in a history crowded with human affairs. Other Mediterranean and Near Eastern traditions add further hints, though they do not always align neatly. Some sources speak of cold, poor harvests, troubled skies, or difficult years. Later chroniclers may preserve earlier notices, but the chain of copying can blur dates and amplify meaning. A scribe writing decades later may arrange events according to theological or moral patterns. A brief notice of famine may reflect one region, not an entire empire. Scholars still debate how confidently each reference can be tied to the atmospheric event of 536. Yet the broader pattern is difficult to ignore, because multiple records from the 6th century world describe conditions that seem abnormal in more than one place. In a period when writers often record omens, comets, earthquakes, wars, and portents, the dimming of the sun stands apart because it matches what volcanic climate forcing can actually do. Far to the west and north, Irish annals preserve memories of crop failure and shortage around the same broad period. These records are precious but complicated. Many entries survive in manuscripts copied long after the events they describe. Their chronology can be difficult, and not every famine notice should be treated as a direct report from the exact year in question. The evidence remains incomplete. Yet Ireland matters because it sits in a climate zone where a shortened or cooled growing season can be especially dangerous. Grain agriculture near the margins of reliability is sensitive to summer temperature and rainfall. When later annals mention failures of bread or shortages in this era, they may be echoing a real environmental shock that struck communities far from imperial centres. The people behind those entries are almost invisible. Their hunger becomes a line in a manuscript, their weather a clue for historians and climatologists. In China, court histories and regional records preserve another kind of witness. Chinese chroniclers often pay close attention to unusual natural events because weather, celestial phenomena, harvests, and political legitimacy are linked in the language of rule. Reports of summer snowfrost, drought, famine, or crop damage in various years cannot be treated as simple global data points. China is vast and climate varies widely across its regions. Political division in the 6th century also shapes record keeping. Still, the presence of unusual cold and agricultural distress in East Asian sources around the mid-6th century adds depth to the picture. It suggests that the atmospheric disturbance is not merely a Mediterranean curiosity. The same altered sky, or the climatic consequences of that sky, may have reached far across Eurasia. The most powerful witness, however, is not a person at all. It is ice. In Greenland and Antarctica, snow falls year after year and compresses into layers trapping chemical traces of the atmosphere. Long after empires fall and languages change, those layers remain. When scientists drill into ice cores, they recover a frozen archive that can preserve sulfate spikes, volcanic particles, and other signals from eruptions powerful enough to affect the climate. Around the mid-6th century, ice cores show evidence consistent with major volcanic activity. This does not read like a human chronicle. It has no fear, no omen, no explanation of hunger, yet it gives the ancient descriptions a physical backbone. Something entered the atmosphere on a scale large enough to be recorded in ice far from the eruption itself. Tree rings provide another quiet testimony. A tree grows outward year by year, and the width and density of its rings reflect the conditions it experiences. Cold summers, drought, and shortened growing seasons can leave narrow or otherwise stressed rings. Around the 530s and 540s, tree ring records from parts of the northern hemisphere show signs of serious cooling. These records do not speak in dates with the emotional force of a chronicle, but they carry their own precision. They show that living organisms responded to environmental stress. A tree in a northern forest knows nothing of Justinian Persia, Ireland, or China. Yet its growth may narrow under the same dimmed sun that troubles farmers and frightens observers. The strange beauty of this evidence is that it joins human memory to biological memory. This combination of written and natural evidence changes the scale of the story. Without the texts, the ice and trees might seem like a climatic event with unknown human consequences. Without the ice and trees, the texts might seem like isolated descriptions, perhaps exaggerated or misunderstood. Together they create a more compelling picture. The dim sun described by a historian, the famine remembered in annals, the cold noted in distant records, the sulfate preserved in ice, and the narrowed growth of trees all point toward a mid-6th century disruption that is both environmental and historical. No single source is perfect. Each has uncertainties. But history often advances by joining imperfect witnesses carefully without pretending they say more than they do. There is a lesser-known difficulty here. Ancient calendars are not always easy to synchronize. Different societies date events by reign years, local eras, religious cycles, or retrospective copying traditions. A year in one chronicle may not correspond cleanly to a modern January to December year. Seasonal references may also shift depending on region and calendar. This means that reconstructing the crisis requires patience. Scholars cannot simply gather every strange weather report and declare it part of the same event. Some belong, some may not. Some may reflect local disasters. Some may be symbolic. The strongest reconstruction comes from patterns that appear across independent evidence, especially when natural archives support the approximate timing. The witnesses also remind us that the year the world went dark was not experienced equally. A court historian sees meaning in signs. A farmer sees the field. A monk sees famine as a moral and spiritual trial. A ruler sees pressure on order. A tree records stress without interpretation. Ice records chemistry without suffering. The event exists at all these levels at once. It is atmospheric, agricultural, political, biological, and psychological. That is why it resists a simple telling. It is not one witness shouting across time, but many quiet voices, each incomplete, each shaped by its own limits together, making the silence around the cause feel even deeper. By the time these fragments are placed side by side, the veil over the sun becomes more than a strange passage in an old book. It becomes a planetary clue. The darkness is no longer only what someone saw from a city street or a farm track. It is something that left residue in ice scars, in wood hunger, in memory and uncertainty and scholarship. The ancient witnesses do not solve the mystery, but they keep it alive long enough for modern science to enter the story. And once the frozen cores and tree rings begin to speak, the search turns from frightened skies and empty granaries toward the hidden engine behind them, a violent event somewhere on Earth, powerful enough to dim the sun for people who never knew its name. Long after the witnesses are gone, after their cities change names or fall into ruin, after their manuscripts are copied, damaged, corrected, mistranslated, and argued over the year, remain stored in places no ancient historian can imagine. It lies in ice, in wood, in mineral dust, in chemical traces so faint that they require instruments more delicate than any empire ever possessed. The 6th century sky leaves no monument. It does not build a temple or carve a royal inscription. It does something stranger. It enters the planet's memory. Snow falls over Greenland. Snow falls over Antarctica. Trees grow in cold forests and high mountains. Each season adds a layer, a ring-a-minute record of conditions that pass unnoticed by people trying to survive them. Centuries later, when scholars begin searching for the cause of the darkened sun, these natural archives become witnesses as important as any chronicler. Ice cores are among the most remarkable archives on Earth because they preserve time vertically. Year after year, snowfall settles and compresses trapping particles, bubbles acids and chemical signatures from the atmosphere above. In some places, the layers are clear enough to count like pages in a frozen book. In others, they require careful modelling, comparison and correction. The work is slow, technical, and far removed from the human fear of 536, yet it reaches toward the same event. When scientists drill deep into an ice sheet and remove a cylinder of ancient ice, they are not simply collecting frozen water. They are lifting a record of old air, old storms, old eruptions, old fires, and old climates. The ice does not remember in words, but it remembers with chemistry. Around the middle of the 6th century, ice cores show strong signals of volcanic activity. These signals often appear as elevated sulfate, a chemical clue left when sulfur gases from a major eruption rise high into the atmosphere and eventually return to Earth. The basic process is powerful and almost invisible from the ground far away. A volcano erupts with enough force to send sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, the atmospheric layer above ordinary weather. There the gas transforms into tiny sulfate aerosols. These particles can spread widely and remain aloft long enough to reflect a portion of incoming sunlight. The result is not a simple blanket of darkness, but a dimming and cooling influence that can disturb climate across enormous distances. People living under the haze may never see ash. They may never hear the eruption. They may only notice that the sun seems weak and the season has gone wrong. The ice helps explain why the ancient descriptions feel so eerie. A volcanic haze in the upper atmosphere does not behave like local smoke or low cloud. It can spread across regions, soften sunlight all to colour, and reduce warmth, while leaving the sky bright enough for ordinary activity. It creates a world that is not night, not eclipse, not storm, but something between normal daylight and disaster. That matches the emotional shape of the accounts, not sudden annihilation, but months of wrongness. What survives in the ice suggests that the dimming was physically real, not only symbolic or literary. Yet the ice also complicates the story, because the mid-6th century does not appear to contain just one clean signal. The evidence points toward a sequence of volcanic disturbances with a major event around 536 and another significant eruption around the early 540s. The darkness, in other words, may have been only the first blow. Tree rings add the living response. In cold regions, trees grow more slowly when summers are short, cloudy or unusually cool. Their annual ring's narrow wood density can change and the forest quietly records stress. The trees are not concerned with human chronology, but they are precise in their own way. A bad growing season becomes a thin line. A run of difficult years becomes a pattern. When tree ring records from different parts of the northern hemisphere show severe cooling, during the 530s and 540s the human reports gain another kind of support. The weakened sun is no longer only a memory from texts. It is present in the bodies of trees that grew under that sky. A forest does not exaggerate for political effect. It does not write omens. It simply grows less when conditions allow less growth. One of the striking things about tree ring evidence is how it turns climate into something visible at the scale of a fingernail. The disaster that spreads through atmosphere and empire can be held as a narrow band in wood. In some regions, the cooling after 536 and the years that follow appears among the most severe of the last 2,000 years. Scholars still debate exact rankings, regional variation, and the best way to compare different records, but the signal is strong enough to place the mid-6th century among the great climatic disturbances of the late Holocene. The phrase can sound technical and remote, yet it refers to seasons that farmers felt in their hands. A narrow tree ring and an empty granary are different records of the same kind of pressure. The ice and tree evidence also reveals why the crisis cannot be understood as a single dramatic scene. Volcanic climate effects can unfold unevenly. The first year after an eruption may be strange. The following years may remain cold. A second eruption can deepen the cooling before recovery is complete. Oceans and atmospheric circulation can distribute impacts in complex ways. One region may suffer severe summer cooling, another unusual rainfall, another drought, another series of frosts. The term global can mislead if it implies uniformity. The better image is a disturbance spreading through a complicated machine, causing different failures in different parts while sharing a common atmospheric origin. No single explanation fully accounts for every local hardship, but the natural archives make clear that the climate system itself had been jolted. Another lesser-known detail lies in the microscopic particles sometimes found in ice. Volcanic glass shards, tiny fragments of erupted material, can occasionally be identified and chemically compared with known volcanic sources. This kind of tephra analysis can help narrow the search for the volcano responsible. It is painstaking work. The fragments and minute contamination must be avoided, and many volcanic regions can produce chemically complex signatures. When researchers examine these particles, they are trying to connect a dim sun described in ancient words to an actual eruption somewhere on Earth. The task is difficult because volcanoes do not always leave convenient evidence, and eruptions large enough to affect climate may come from remote places where deposits are buried, eroded underwater, or poorly preserved. The source of the 536 event remains debated, which keeps the mystery alive even as the broad volcanic explanation has become stronger. The ice cores do not only show that eruptions happened, they also help show timing. Dating ice layers is a science of careful alignment using annual markers, known eruptions, chemical cycles, and comparison between cores. It is not magic, and it is not free from uncertainty. Layers can thin with depth. Snowfall can vary. Volcanic sulfate may arrive in different hemispheres at different times depending on eruption location and atmospheric circulation. Still, when multiple cores show related signals, confidence increases. This is where the frozen archive becomes so valuable. It can place an eruption close enough to the historical accounts that the connection becomes more than coincidence. The dim sun of 536 begins to look like the human face of a volcanic sulfate layer. The scientific reconstruction is powerful precisely because it does not depend on one kind of evidence. Written records provide experience, ice cores provide atmospheric chemistry, tree rings provide biological response. Together they allow scholars to reconstruct not only an event, but a chain eruption, atmospheric aerosols, reduced sunlight, cooling ecological stress, agricultural difficulty, and social consequences. Each link has uncertainties. Some are stronger than others. The evidence remains incomplete, especially when moving from climate stress to specific political or cultural outcomes. Yet the chain is plausible and increasingly well supported. It transforms the story from a legend of darkness into a case study in how natural forces can move through history without leaving a single battlefield. There is a quiet irony in this. The people who lived under the dim sun searched the sky for meaning, but the strongest clues were falling invisibly into ice thousands of miles away. They looked upward, while the future would look downward, drilling into frozen ground to understand what had passed overhead. The ancient world experienced the event as confusion. The modern world studies it as data. Neither perspective is complete by itself. Data without human experience can become sterile. Human testimony without physical evidence can become uncertain. Together they make the year vivid, a pale sun seen by frightened observers, a chemical spike sealed in ice, a narrow ring in a tree, and a harvest that does not fill the granary. By the time the natural archives are read, the year 536 is no longer merely an oddity in late antique chronicles. It becomes part of Earth's climatic history. It shows how a volcano perhaps far from the major centers of written civilization can alter the lives of people across continents. It shows how the atmosphere can connect places that have no political relationship and no shared language. It shows how nature writes in multiple scripts at once. Sulfate in ice growth, in wood hunger, in bodies, anxiety in texts. And it leads the investigation toward a harder question. If the evidence points so strongly toward volcanic darkness, then where did the eruption happen? And why is the culprit still so difficult to name? The volcano at the center of the mystery is both everywhere and nowhere. Its effects appear in the sky, in ice, in tree growth, in harvest failure, and in human memory, yet the mountain itself remains elusive. This is one of the strangest parts of the year 536. A force strong enough to dim the sun across wide regions does not step forward clearly in the record. No ancient witness points with certainty to a named crater. No surviving account gives a perfect description of a colossal eruption at the right time and place. The culprit hides behind distance-damaged evidence, uncertain dating, and the simple fact that the most important disasters in history are not always witnessed by the societies that later suffer from them. Volcanic eruptions can change climate only under certain conditions. Many volcanoes are terrifying locally, but leave little long-term effect on the wider atmosphere. Lava flows may destroy towns, ash may bury fields, pyroclastic currents may erase life on a mountain's slopes. But if the eruption does not inject enough sulfur high enough into the stratosphere, its climatic reach remains limited. The eruption linked to 536 must have been different. It likely sends sulfur gases far above ordinary weather into a layer of the atmosphere where tiny sulfate particles can linger and travel. There, they scatter sunlight. They do not need to block the sun completely. They only need to reduce enough incoming energy to cool the surface, shorten growing seasons, and turn normal weather patterns unstable. A small change in sunlight can become a large change in human life. For people near such an eruption, the disaster would have been immediate and violent. The air may have filled with ash, rivers may have choked with sediment, roofs may have collapsed under volcanic fallout, crops may have been buried, animals may have died from contaminated pasture or water. Darkness near the volcano could have been thick and suffocating, not merely pale. Yet if the eruption occurred in a remote region, sparsely documented landscape high latitude island or place, whose written traditions did not survive the local catastrophe, could vanish almost completely from human history. The wider world would remember the atmospheric consequences while losing the event itself. That is the volcano problem. The shadow is global, but the source is hidden. Scientists have considered several possibilities. Some evidence has suggested that the eruption may have occurred in the northern hemisphere, possibly at a high latitude because of the way sulfate and microscopic particles appear in ice records. Other research has examined volcanic systems in North America, Iceland, Alaska, and elsewhere, looking for chemical matches, eruption deposits and dates that align with the mid-6th century signal. The search is difficult, because volcanic fingerprints are not always clean. Tiny glass shards in ice can offer clues, but they may be sparse, altered, or difficult to compare with incomplete databases of volcanic deposits. A volcano can erupt explosively and still leave evidence that is later buried, eroded, submerged, or mistaken for another event. Scholars still debate the best candidate, and no single explanation fully accounts for every piece of evidence. This uncertainty can be frustrating, but it is also a useful reminder of how historical science works. The strongest conclusion is not always the most detailed one. It may be possible to say with confidence that a major volcanic event occurred around 536 while remaining uncertain about the exact volcano. That distinction matters. The absence of a named culprit does not make the dimming imaginary. It means the investigation has reached the limit of current evidence. In the same way, a physician can diagnose poisoning from symptoms and chemical traces, even if the original container is lost. The planet shows signs of volcanic forcing. The atmosphere appears to have been loaded with reflective material. Trees and texts respond. The name of the mountain remains the missing piece. Popular retelling sometimes rush into more dramatic explanations. They may suggest an asteroid impact, a cosmic dust cloud, a comet, or some hidden catastrophe outside mainstream evidence. Such ideas attract attention because darkness from the sky, easily invites celestial imagination, yet the strongest evidence points toward volcanism. Ice core sulfate is exactly the kind of signal expected after major eruptions. Tree ring cooling fits volcanic aerosol forcing. Historical descriptions of a dim sun match what large eruptions can produce. Impact theories require evidence of impact debris crater formation or other markers that have not convincingly matched the 536 event. This does not mean every detail is solved. It means the explanation with the best support is earthly, not cosmic a volcano, or more likely a sequence of volcanic events changing the atmosphere from below. The scale of such an eruption is hard to imagine because modern experience offers only partial comparisons. The eruption of Tambora in 1815 caused the so-called year without a summer in 1816, bringing cold crop failures and social distress across parts of the northern hemisphere. Krakatoa in 1883 produced vivid sunsets and measurable climatic effects. Pinatubo in 1991 cooled global temperatures for a short time after injecting sulfur into the stratosphere. These events help modern scholars understand mechanisms, but they cannot be transferred too neatly onto the 6th century. The eruption around 536 occurred in a different world, one without modern transport, industrial agriculture, global relief systems, weather satellites, or scientific explanation. A climate shock that is disruptive today could be far more socially dangerous in a world where grain stores and local harvest define survival. The volcano problem also reveals the difference between cause and consequence. Finding the eruption explains why sunlight weakens, but it does not automatically explain what happens to every society below. Climate is a pressure, not a script. A volcanic haze can cool regions, but political outcomes depend on local conditions. A well-supplied city may endure. A marginal farming community may collapse. A ruler may use crisis to strengthen control while another loses legitimacy. A trade network may help buffer shortage, or it may spread scarcity through rising prices. The eruption is the beginning of a chain, not the entire chain. What survives in the record suggests that environmental stress enters a world already shaped by war inequality belief and fragile logistics. There is also the question of season. Timing matters intensely. An eruption that dims sunlight before or during the growing season can be far more damaging than one whose strongest effects arrive after harvest. If aerosols spread during critical months, crops may fail to mature. If cooling persists into the following year, seed reserves and livestock recovery suffer. If another eruption follows before systems recover the damaged compounds. The mid-6th century evidence suggests not a single clean interruption, but a period of repeated stress. This is why 536 cannot be understood only as one dark year. It may be the opening of a colder, harsher interval that continues to test societies after the first shock fades. For ancient people, none of this mechanism is visible. They do not know that sulfur dioxide has risen into the stratosphere. They do not know that aerosols are reflecting sunlight. They do not know that a mountain, perhaps across an ocean, or far beyond their political world, may have altered their harvest. Their explanations come from the intellectual tools available to them: divine displeasure, celestial disorder, fate sin, imperial failure, or the mysterious will of heaven. Modern observers may be tempted to dismiss those interpretations, but the emotional truth beneath them is understandable. The sky has changed, and no human power can repair it. When the most constant presence in life becomes uncertain, people search for meaning because meaning is one of the few forms of control left. The volcano itself may have been destroyed in part by its own violence. Explosive eruptions can collapse craters, reshape landscapes, and scatter evidence across oceans and ice sheets. Later eruptions can cover older deposits, Forests can reclaim slopes, glaciers can grind rock, seas can hide ash. Human memory can disappear if communities are small, displaced, or unwritten. A mountain can change the history of continents and still leave behind only a chemical whisper. That is why the search feels almost ghostly. Scientists are not simply looking for a crater, they are looking for a vanished moment of planetary violence reconstructed from particles small enough to rest invisibly in ancient snow. The mystery of the volcano keeps the story grounded in uncertainty. It prevents the year 536 from becoming too neat. The evidence is strong enough to show that a major atmospheric disturbance occurred, probably volcanic in origin, but incomplete enough to leave open the exact geography of the event. That combination is not weakness. It is the honest shape of the past. History and science rarely recover catastrophe in perfect outline. They recover edges, residues, echoes, and patterns. In this case, the pattern is unmistakably severe. A great eruption somewhere on Earth, a veil across the sun, a cooling world, and societies forced to endure consequences from a disaster whose source most of them never saw. The volcano problem therefore deepens the darkness rather than simply explaining it away. It gives the year a cause but also leaves it haunted. Somewhere a mountain opens, somewhere ash rises, somewhere sulfur enters the high air. Then the local violence becomes a hemispheric dimness, and the people far away see only the pale result. The world goes on under a sun that no longer warms as it should, while the true engine of the crisis remains hidden beyond their horizon. The first darkness is terrible enough, but the deeper danger lies in what follows. A society can sometimes absorb one bad year if reserves hold, if neighbouring regions have surplus, if roads remain passable, if rulers respond carefully, if disease does not spread, and if the next harvest repairs what the last one damaged. Human communities are built around the hope that misfortune passes. The year 536 challenges that hope, because the evidence does not point to one isolated atmospheric wound that heals cleanly. It points toward a chain of eruptions and a sequence of cold years, with another major volcanic signal appearing in the early 540s. The world does not simply stumble once. It appears to be struck weakened and then struck again before recovery can fully take root. This matters because resilience depends on time. A granary emptied by one failed harvest needs good seasons to refill. A herd reduced by hunger needs years to rebuild. A household that has sold tools, eaten seed grain, borrowed heavily, or lost labourers does not return to strength the moment the sun brightens. A state that has spent money on war and emergency supply cannot immediately restore its treasury. A village that has abandoned marginal fields may not reoccupy them quickly. The first shock removes the cushion. The second shock lands on the exposed body of society. What survives in the natural record suggests that the mid-6th century may have entered exactly this dangerous pattern. Not a single disaster, but a cold pulse followed by another, turning a strange year into a prolonged crisis. Ice cores preserve this sequence in chemistry. Around 536 volcanic sulfate appears in the frozen archive. Then several years later another major sulfate signal appears, often associated with the early 540s. The exact sources remain debated, and the details of each eruption are still studied, but the broad picture is clear enough to change the story. A veil across the sky may begin the trouble, but a second eruption can extend or renew, cooling just when societies are trying to recover. This helps explain why some researchers describe the period not only as the year of darkness, but as the beginning of the late antique Little Ice Age, a cooler interval that appears to affect much of the northern hemisphere for decades. Scholars still debate its regional strength, exact boundaries, and historical consequences, but the idea captures something important. 536 belongs to a larger climatic disturbance. The phrase late antique little ice age can sound too clean, almost like a label placed over a chaotic human experience. In reality, people do not live through climate periods as neat blocks of time. They live through one spring, one harvest, one winter, one illness, one tax demand, one journey, one death, one decision to stay or leave. A cooler climate does not announce itself as an era. It arrives through repeated disappointments. A field yields less than expected. A winter stores itself in the bones. A river freezes unusually. Snow falls where it should not. A merchant hears that grain is expensive in another port too. A ruler learns that one region cannot supply what was promised. The great climatic pattern is built from these local failures, each one small enough to be overlooked by history unless enough of them accumulate. The second eruption, likely around 540 or 541, is therefore crucial. It may help explain why the 6th century crisis becomes so severe. A first volcanic event can inject aerosols into the atmosphere and cool the planet for a few years. A later eruption can add more aerosols, renew the dimming, and prolong the cooling. Even if the sky no longer looks as dramatically strange as it did in 536, the climate system may remain disturbed. The visible mystery gives way to a less visible hardship. People may no longer speak constantly of the pale sun, but they still feel the altered seasons. Disaster moves from spectacle into condition. This layered stress is especially dangerous in the north. Archaeological and environmental evidence from Scandinavia has led some scholars to suggest severe disruption in parts of the region during the 6th century. Settlement patterns, abandoned farms, changes in burial customs, and later cultural memories have all been discussed in connection with climatic deterioration. The evidence remains incomplete, and it would be too simple to claim that volcanoes alone explain every social transformation in northern Europe. Yet the timing is striking. In landscapes where agriculture already presses against climatic limits, a series of cold years can force choices that are not easily reversed. Farms on marginal land may be deserted. Elites may compete more aggressively for surviving resources. Communities may turn to ritual sacrifice hoarding or political consolidation as older patterns of security weaken. Farther south, repeated eruptions can strain different systems in different ways. Mediterranean agriculture is varied, and not every crop responds to cooling in the same manner. Some areas may suffer from cold, others may face disrupted rain or unusual storms. Vineyards, orchards, and olive groves may respond differently from grain fields. Large estates may absorb losses better than small farmers. Cities may draw supplies from wider territories, but only if those territories still produce surplus. The Roman state, especially under Justinian, is ambitious and administratively capable, yet ambition does not protect grain from weather. A chain of eruptions turns the empire's scale into both strength and burden. It can move resources, but it also has many mouths to feed and many wars to finance. The early 540s bring an even darker complication, because this is the period when the Justinianic plague enters the Mediterranean world. Climate shock does not simply cause plague in a direct and tidy way, and the evidence must be handled carefully. Plague is caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis transmitted through complex relationships among rodents. Fleas human movement, trade, and ecology. No responsible account should reduce it to cold weather alone. Still, environmental disruption can influence animal populations, food stress movement, and vulnerability. Repeated eruptions may create conditions in which societies are already weakened when disease arrives. The chain is not simple, but history often turns on interactions rather than single causes. A dimmed sun, failed harvest, war trade, and plague can converge without one explaining all the others. This is why the mid-6th century feels so heavy in retrospect. It is not one disaster with one cause and one consequence. It is a convergence. The atmosphere is disturbed. Food systems weaken. Empires fight. Populations move. Disease spreads. Written records become anxious. Natural archives record cooling. Archaeological traces hint at stress and reorganization. Some regions endure better than others, and some transformations credited to catastrophe may have deeper roots. Still, no single explanation fully accounts for the pattern, unless the environmental shocks are taken seriously. The chain of eruptions provides a planetary background, against which human events become sharper and more precarious. A lesser-known aspect of volcanic cooling is that its effect can linger in social systems long after the aerosols themselves fade. Sulfate particles eventually fall out of the atmosphere. The sky clears. Sunsets return to ordinary colours. Summers may warm again, but debts remain. Graves remain. Abandoned fields do not immediately plough themselves. Trade routes interrupted by scarcity or fear may take time to recover. A ruler who raises taxes during crisis may create resentment that survives the climate event. A family that loses children to hunger or disease does not become whole when weather improves. The atmosphere can recover faster than society. This delay makes the crisis easy to underestimate if one looks only at climate data. The human afterlife of environmental shock is longer than the physical event that begins it. The chain of eruptions also exposes the weakness of memory. People are good at remembering spectacular signs like a dim sun, a hard winter, or a famine. They are less able to perceive slow cumulative pressure. A community may remember one terrible year while forgetting that several mediocre years after it did equal damage. Later storytellers may compress hardship into a single omen or legendary winter. Chroniclers may record the most dramatic sign and leave out the gradual exhaustion that follows. Natural archives help correct this by showing that climate stress can stretch across years. But even they cannot show the full emotional rhythm hope after one poor harvest, fear after the second, despair after the third, and the dull practical courage required to plant again under an uncertain sky. By the early 540s the world has not ended, but it has changed. Some fields still produce, some cities still function, armies still march, merchants still bargain, children still learn the tasks of adults. But the margin of safety has narrowed. The first veil over the sun has introduced uncertainty into the seasons, and later volcanic shocks appear to deepen the instability. The disaster is no longer only above people. It is inside their systems of storage, supply, authority, and belief. The sky may brighten, but the damage has already entered the ground. This story therefore moves from darkness to duration. A single year can frighten the world. A chain of years can reshape it. The eruptions of the mid-6th century, known through ice and trees more clearly than through any ancient map, suggest that the year 536 was not merely an isolated anomaly. It was the opening note in a longer cold sequence, a period when the sun's weakness became harvest. Weakness, harvest weakness became social strain, and social strain waited for the next calamity to arrive. That next calamity would not come as haze. It would come through bodies, ships, animals, ports, and breath entering history under another name. Disease enters the story like a second darkness, not in the sky but in the body. By the early 540s, the world has already endured strange light-cold seasons and repeated environmental pressure. Food systems are strained. Communities are tired. Armies and merchants continue to move through ports and roads because history does not pause for recovery. Then another force begins to travel through the connected world, quieter than an eruption, at first smaller than ash, invisible to the eye but capable of remaking household cities, armies, and empires. The Justinianic plague does not belong to the sky in the simple way the volcanic veil does, yet it arrives in a world already made vulnerable by years of climatic stress. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate the exact relationship between climate disruption and plague, but the convergence is one of the most unsettling features of the 6th century. The disease generally identified as the Justinianic plague is caused by Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium associated with later plague pandemics. Its movement depends on complex relationships among rodents, flees human settlements, trade grain storage ships, and ecological disturbance. It is not simply a punishment from cold weather, and it is not responsible to say that the darkened sun caused plague in a direct mechanical way. Disease history rarely works like that. Pathogens move through living networks. Rodent populations rise and fall. Fleas seek hosts. Ships carry grain and stowaways. People flee, hunger follow armies, trade in ports, gather in cities and bury their dead. A climate shock can disturb these networks without being the sole cause of what follows. No single explanation fully accounts for the plague's arrival, but environmental stress may have helped shape the conditions through which it spread. The first great outbreak in the Mediterranean world is traditionally associated with the reign of Emperor Justinian, and becomes especially notorious when it reaches Constantinople in 542. The capital is not just a city, it is a machine of consumption. Grain arrives by sea, goods come from across the empire and beyond. Officials, soldiers, clergy, labourers, merchants, sailors, slaves, and visitors crowd its streets and harbours. A city like this can become a centre of civilization because it draws the world inward. That same strength becomes danger when disease travels with the movement of food and people. The harbours that feed Constantinople also connect it to distant ecological zones. The roads and sea lanes that carry imperial power also carry uncertainty. Accounts of the plague in Constantinople are among the most haunting passages in late antique history, though they must be read with caution. Writers shaped by fear and moral interpretation describe sudden illness, swollen lymph nodes, fever, delirium, death overwhelmed burial systems, and a city struggling to keep pace with mortality. Some numbers in ancient plague accounts are likely exaggerated or symbolic, and scholars still debate the true demographic scale. Yet even cautious interpretation leaves a severe event. The disease is not merely a rumour. It disrupts daily life, administration, labour, and emotional order. In a city built on routine supply ceremony and imperial confidence, mass illness turns the normal rhythm of life into something fragile and strange. The plague's timing matters because it follows the climatic disturbances rather than appearing in an otherwise stable world. Years of poor harvests and cold can weaken bodies through malnutrition or stress. Food scarcity can push people to move, gather, or rely on emergency supplies. Grain storage can attract rodents. Trade routes may shift under pressure. War can move troops and animals across regions. None of these factors creates Yersinia pestis, but they can influence how a disease spreads and how societies withstand it. The evidence remains incomplete, especially for linking specific climate events to specific plague pathways, but the larger overlap is difficult to ignore. The mid-6th century becomes a collision of atmospheric, ecological, and human systems. For ordinary families, plague transforms fear into intimacy. A darkened sun can frighten a whole village at once, but disease enters house by house. It changes how people touch, care, wait, and mourn. A person may appear well and then weaken quickly. Work stops not because fields vanish, but because hands cannot rise. Markets thin. Funerals multiply. The living face practical horrors as much as emotional ones. Who carries the dead, who bakes bread, who tends animals, who watches children, who repairs tools, who keeps accounts, who opens the gates, who rows the ships. A society is made of roles performed repeatedly. Plague removes the people who perform them. Even when survivors remain, the interruption can break confidence. In the countryside, the plague's effects are harder to see but no less important. Rural deaths may not be recorded with the same detail as urban crisis. Farms may lose labour at crucial times. Families may abandon holdings. Landlords may find rents hard to collect. Villages may merge, shrink, or vanish from written visibility. In some regions, lower population could reduce pressure on land in the long term, but that does not soften the immediate shock. Death creates empty rooms before it creates economic adjustment. The living inherit land debts, animals' grief and unfinished work. Where climate stress has already reduced surplus, plague can turn hardship into rupture. The Byzantine state suffers because empire depends on people as much as territory. Soldiers, tax collectors, sailors, builders, scribes, farmers, muleteers, craftsmen and administrators are all parts of imperial power. A map may still show provinces under control, but a province weakened by famine and disease cannot provide the same revenue or manpower. Justinian's empire is engaged in costly wars and restoration campaigns, especially in the Western Mediterranean. The plague does not simply kill individuals. It interferes with the state's ability to sustain ambition. Armies become harder to supply. Tax burdens may grow more bitter. Reconstruction slows. Cities lose workers. The emperor's plans continue, but the human material beneath them is damaged. The Persian Empire and other neighbouring societies are not sealed away from the crisis. Disease does not respect political borders, especially in a world of trade war diplomacy and movement. The Near East, the Red Sea, Egypt, the Levant, Mesopotamia and Mediterranean ports form connected zones where goods and people circulate. Plague likely moves unevenly, flaring in some places, sparing others, for a time returning in waves. This wave-like pattern becomes one of its terrifying features. A community that survives one outbreak may face another years later. The Justinianic plague is not a single moment, but the beginning of a pandemic period that recurs for generations. The first blow is shocking. The returns make it historical. A lesser-known point is that plague can reshape memory by overwhelming explanation. When several disasters occur close together later, observers may blend them into a single age of judgment. Dim skies, famine, war, and disease become morally connected in the imagination even when their physical causes differ. This is not foolishness. It is a way of making unbearable coincidence meaningful. Modern analysis separates volcanic aerosols from bacterial infection, climate forcing from military policy harvest, failure from trade networks. People living through the 6th century do not experience those categories separately. They experience a world in which the sky weakens, food becomes uncertain, and bodies begin to die. The boundaries between natural disaster, divine warning, political failure, and personal grief blur. At the same time, caution is essential. It would be misleading to claim that 536 automatically causes the Justinianic plague, or that climate alone explains the pandemic. Plague has its own ecology and history. Genetic studies of ancient DNA have helped confirm the presence of Yersinia pestis in early medieval plague victims, but they do not turn the pandemic into a simple climate footnote. The disease may have roots in rodent reservoirs far from the Mediterranean, and its spread involves trade and movement as much as weather. Scholars still debate where the pandemic begins, how it travels, and how many people die. The strongest understanding is layered climate disruption weakens and destabilizes parts of the world, while plague enters through biological and commercial pathways that exploit connection. This layered view makes the 6th century more frightening because it feels less like a single catastrophe and more like a system under repeated assault. The atmosphere dims, harvests falter, eruptions continue, disease spreads, wars consume resources, states demand revenue, communities adapt, but adaptation has limits. The world does not collapse everywhere and many institutions survive. The Byzantine Empire continues, Persia remains powerful, villages endure, trade persists, children grow up in the aftermath. Yet survival does not mean the crisis is small. A civilization can survive and still be permanently altered. A household can continue and still never recover the people it has lost. Disease enters the story then not as an interruption but as a deepening. The darkness that began above the clouds now has a counterpart under the skin. Both are invisible in their causes to the people who suffer them. Both travel through systems larger than any one community can see. Both reveal the vulnerability of a connected world. The pale sun shows that the atmosphere can bind distant lands together in hardship. Plague shows that human networks can do the same. By the time the first great wave of disease passes through the Mediterranean, the year 536 has become more than a mystery of dim light. It has become the opening to an age when climate, hunger, empire, and infection meet in one of history's most uneasy convergences. Empires do not experience disaster as a single body even when their maps make them look whole. A line of authority may run from palace to province, from emperor to governor, from tax office to village, but the pressure of a darkened world travels unevenly through that line. In one place it is a poor harvest, in another it is a delay in supply, in another it is a garrison waiting for grain, in another it is a merchant refusing risk, in another it is a city where disease has thinned the workers who unload ships and bake bread. The 6th century crisis does not strike the Byzantine Empire, Persia, and neighbouring worlds as a clean blow that historians can measure in one number. It works more like damp entering stone moving through cracks already present. The Byzantine Empire under Justinian is one of the most ambitious states of late antiquity. It has law, bureaucracy, armies, taxation, diplomacy, monumental architecture, and a vision of restored Roman power. Its capital, Constantinople, stands between Europe and Asia, facing the waters that connect the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. From there, imperial command reaches across provinces with different languages, landscapes, and memories. Egypt supplies grain, Anatolia supplies soldiers and taxes, Syria and the Levant connect the empire to trade routes, deserts, frontier politics, and religious communities. North Africa, recently reconquered from the Vandals, becomes a symbol of imperial recovery. Italy becomes the great prize and the great wound because the effort to reclaim it from Gothic rule turns into a long destructive war. The empire is not weak in any simple sense, but it is extended. Justinian's program depends on confidence. He builds, codifies, conquers, negotiates, and commands as though the Roman world can still be gathered under imperial order. His age produces the great legal compilation later known as the Corpus Juris Civilis, a monumental attempt to organize Roman law. His reign sees the construction of Hagia Sophia after the Nika revolt, a building that seems to turn stone-gold geometry and light into a statement of sacred authority. His armies, led by commanders such as Belisarius and Narses, win extraordinary victories in North Africa and Italy. In ordinary political history, these achievements dominate the story. Yet behind them lies the unglamorous question that decides how long ambition can last. Can the empire keep extracting enough food, money, labour, and loyalty from a world that is growing colder, hungrier, and sicker? The darkened sky does not cancel Justinian's ambitions, but it makes them more expensive in human terms. Taxes must still be collected even when harvests weaken. Soldiers must still be fed even when granaries strain. Reconstruction must continue even when labour is lost. In some cases, governments respond to crisis by tightening demands because the state's obligations do not shrink when the countryside suffers. The army on campaign cannot simply wait until weather improves. The imperial court cannot admit that cosmic uncertainty has become a budgetary force. Officials may reduce delay requisition, compel or improvise, but every solution transfers pressure somewhere. The village feels the empire not only through law and protection, but through the demand that it continue paying into a system under stress. In Italy, the consequences are especially severe because war and environmental hardship overlap. The Gothic War devastates parts of the peninsula over decades. Armies move through landscapes, cities change hands, sieges damage urban life, and agriculture suffers from insecurity. When climate stress and plague are added to war, the result is not one cause, but a convergence that weakens recovery. Rome itself, once the centre of an empire, becomes a city of diminished population and broken infrastructure compared with its ancient height. It is not destroyed in one moment, but worn down through repeated shocks. What survives in the record suggests a world where imperial restoration and local ruin can exist at the same time. A victory on paper may leave behind fields, untilled aqueducts, damaged elites displaced, and ordinary people struggling to survive among the remains of older grandeur. North Africa shows a different side of the problem. The region has long been one of the great agricultural zones of the Mediterranean, rich in grain oil and urban culture. Its reconquest is a major success for Justinian, but holding it requires administration defense and integration after the defeat of Vandal power. Environmental disruption may not strike every part of Africa in the same way as colder northern lands, yet the region is not isolated from imperial extraction, trade disturbance, or plague. A province can be productive and still become strained if the demands placed on it increase while wider systems weaken. The empire's strength lies partly in moving resources from one region to another, but this strength becomes dangerous when too many regions need support at once. On the eastern frontier, Rome's rivalry with the Sasanian Persian Empire continues to shape politics and war. Persia is not a barbarian shadow beyond civilization. It is a sophisticated imperial power with its own court culture, administrative traditions, religious structures, armies, and strategic ambitions. The Roman-Persian frontier is one of the great pressure zones of the ancient world. Fortresses, cities, client rulers, desert tribes, merchants and diplomats all operate in the space between empires. War here consumes treasure, and people and peace often requires payments, negotiations, and uneasy compromise. If climate stress reduces agricultural output, or plague reduces manpower, both empires face sharper limits, though the evidence for specific impacts varies by region and remains incomplete. The Persian Empire, like Rome, depends on the relationship between land and rule. Irrigation systems, estate structures, trade routes, and military obligations bind society together. Environmental stress can affect pasture crop yields, taxation, and local stability. But it would be too simple to imagine Persia merely weakened by the same events in the same way. Different regions have different climates and political arrangements. Some may endure, some may suffer, some may even gain relative advantage if rivals are more damaged. Scholars still debate how directly the mid-6th century climate crisis affects Sasanian power. What is clear is that both great empires operate in a world where war continues despite environmental uncertainty, and war itself reduces the flexibility needed to respond to disaster. The plague adds another layer to imperial fragility. In Constantinople, the disease attacks the capital's labour force, administrative rhythm, and sense of divine favour. In the provinces, its waves may reduce taxpayers, farmers, soldiers, and craftsmen. Ancient numbers are uncertain, and some accounts may exaggerate mortality, but even a smaller severe outbreak can disrupt a pre-modern state. Modern people sometimes imagine empire as a structure of rulers and armies, but much of its strength lies in routine. Someone must harvest grain-load ships, copy records, collect customs duties, repair roads, carry messages, mint coins, tend animals, bake bread, and maintain irrigation. Plague does not need to kill everyone to damage routine. It only needs to remove enough people from enough tasks at the wrong time. There is a lesser-known political danger in disaster explanation itself becomes contested. When skies dim, crops fail, and disease spreads, people look for causes that fit their worldview. Religious disputes can intensify because suffering demands interpretation. Imperial policy can be judged as righteous or cursed. Enemies can be blamed. Minorities, outsiders, or rival factions can become convenient targets. A ruler's legitimacy depends not only on winning battles, but on appearing aligned with cosmic and divine order. In the 6th century, where theology and politics are deeply intertwined, catastrophe can become a language of accusation. The evidence remains uneven for exactly how the darkened sky shaped political rhetoric in every region, but the wider principle is clear. Disasters do not simply damage bodies and fields, they damage trust. At the same time, empires are not passive victims. They adapt, redirect, and endure. The Byzantine state continues after Justinian. It does not fall in 536 or 542. Its institutions are damaged but not erased. It remains a major power for centuries, though transformed by later wars, religious conflict, economic pressures, and the rise of new forces. Persia also endures into the following century before facing its own dramatic struggles. This survival matters because it prevents the story from becoming simplistic. The year the world went dark does not topple the ancient order overnight. It contributes to a harsher environment in which existing ambitions become harder to sustain, and existing weaknesses become more dangerous. The great empires under the dim sun reveal the scale of the crisis. In a village, darkness becomes hunger. In a city, it becomes supply anxiety and disease. In an empire, it becomes fiscal strain, military difficulty, political interpretation, and administrative exhaustion. The same atmospheric event moves through different layers of society, changing shape as it goes. It is not enough to say the climate changed. The real historical force lies in how that change meets taxation, war, trade, belief, and power. Under the weakened sun, the imperial world still marches, builds, argues, prays, and fights. But it does so with less margin, and in history the loss of margin is often where transformation begins, far from the great capitals where imperial decrees arrive slowly, or not at all. The dark years leave a different kind of evidence. Northern Europe does not speak with the same continuous written voice as Constantinople, Persia, or China. Its records are thinner, later more fragmentary, and often filtered through archaeology rather than chronicles. Yet silence is not emptiness. A deserted farm, a changed burial custom, a hoard hidden in the ground, a hall burned or abandoned, a settlement pattern altered across a landscape, can carry the pressure of history in ways that no official text records. In the north, the year 536 and the colder interval that follows may have struck communities living close to the edge of agricultural possibility, where a shorter summer is not an inconvenience but a threat to the entire pattern of life. Scandinavia is especially important in this part of the story because its environment magnifies climatic stress. Farming in many northern regions depends on careful timing, Grain must be sown, grown, harvested, dried, and stored within a season already limited by latitude. Livestock need fodder for long winters. Haymaking matters as much as grain because animals are wealth traction milk meat, hides manure and status. A poor summer can echo through winter as hunger for both humans and animals. If pasture weakens and hay yields fall, people may face the grim choice of slaughtering animals they need for future survival. If seed grain is eaten, the next year begins wounded. A climate shock that might be difficult in a warmer, more flexible region can become devastating in a colder landscape where margins are narrow. Archaeology from parts of Scandinavia has been interpreted by some scholars as evidence for significant 6th century disruption. In certain areas, farms appear to be abandoned. Settlement density may decline. Elite centres change. Gold objects and valuable items are deposited in ways that may suggest ritual responses, wealth, concentration, crisis behaviour, or political transformation. Graves and material culture show shifts that are difficult to reduce to one cause. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate how much of this change should be tied directly to the volcanic events of 536 and the early 540s. Population movement, social competition, changing trade, internal conflict, and long-term political development all matter. Yet the timing of climate stress is difficult to ignore. A severe cooling in the mid-6th century would have placed extraordinary pressure on northern communities already dependent on short growing seasons. One of the most haunting possibilities is that some landscapes became temporarily less livable, not because people forgot how to farm, but because farming itself became too unreliable. A family might endure one poor harvest. A village might survive with stored food, livestock trade, fishing, hunting, gathering, and help from kin. But repeated cold summers can change calculation. Marginal farms, especially those at higher elevations or in less favourable soils, may be abandoned first. People may move toward better land, stronger patrons, coastal resources, or fortified centres. In archaeology, this can look like sudden silence houses, no longer repaired fields, no longer maintained ordinary domestic debris, disappearing from places where lives once unfolded. Behind that silence may be decisions made under pressure, not dramatic collapse in a single night. The North also preserves signs of social response that are harder to interpret. Valuable deposits of gold and other objects in some regions have been linked by certain researchers to crisis-era ritual activity, perhaps offerings made during a time when the sun itself seemed threatened. This interpretation is fascinating but uncertain. Gold may be hidden for many reasons: ritual sacrifice, political display, wealth, storage, conflict, inheritance, or social competition. It would be too simple to say that every precious object placed in the ground during the 6th century is a response to the darkened sun. Still, the idea has power because gold resembles sunlight in colour and symbolic force. In a world where the sun weakens offerings of bright metal to powers beyond human control would not be psychologically surprising. What survives in the record suggests that northern elites and communities may have responded to crisis not only with migration and adaptation, but with ritual attempts to restore order. Later, Norse myth contains images of terrible winters, the weakening of the sun, and a world moving toward cosmic catastrophe. The famous idea of a great winter before the end of the world has sometimes been discussed in relation to memories of the 6th century climate crisis. This possibility must be handled carefully. Myths are not direct weather reports. They are layered, poetic, transmitted through time, reshaped by oral tradition, later writing Christian influence and cultural imagination. Scholars still debate whether any specific mythic motif can be traced back to the events around 536. Yet it remains plausible that generations living through severe cold, dim skies, famine and social rupture might pass down memories that later become woven into cosmic stories. The evidence does not allow certainty, but the emotional connection is striking. A weakened sun is exactly the kind of event that can become larger than history in the mind of a culture. Northern Europe's silent evidence also reminds us that collapse is rarely evenly distributed. Some communities may vanish from the archaeological record while others grow stronger. Crisis can destroy, but it can also concentrate power. If small farms fail, people may gather around leaders who control better land-stored food trade access or military protection. Elites may gain dependence. Warrior groups may become more important if competition over resources sharpens. Long-distance exchange may decline in some areas and intensify in others. A cold crisis can reorganize society rather than simply reduce it. What looks like abandonment in one valley may correspond to consolidation in another. This unevenness makes the historical picture difficult but also more realistic. The northern evidence is less textual than Mediterranean evidence, but in some ways it is more intimate with ordinary survival. An imperial historian may describe the sun. A court chronicle may note famine. Archaeology shows where people stopped living, where they buried their dead differently, where they placed wealth into the earth, where farms lost continuity. It brings the crisis down to thresholds of daily life, the barn without enough fodder, the field too cold for reliable grain, the household deciding whether to remain the local leader gaining authority because others need protection. The silence of the sources forces caution, but it also leaves room to imagine how environmental pressure feels in places where no one writes a polished history. A lesser-known detail is that northern societies often rely on mixed subsistence strategies that can both buffer and complicate disaster. Farming may be combined with fishing hunting, gathering, herding, craft production and exchange. Coastal communities may survive poor grain years better if marine resources remain accessible. Inland communities may rely more heavily on livestock or stored crops. Elites may control redistribution through feasts, halls, and gift networks. A climate shock does not strike one uniform economy. It strikes a mosaic. This helps explain why the archaeological response varies. Some places contract, some adapt, some appear to transform socially. The darkness is shared, but survival is local. By the time the cold years pass into memory, Northern Europe may have been altered in ways that later centuries inherit without fully remembering the cause. Settlement patterns change, power structures evolve, stories of cosmic winter may take shape or gain force. Communities that endure carry forward new forms of dependence, hierarchy, and belief. It is impossible to draw a straight line from volcanic aerosols to every later development in the north, and responsible history must resist that temptation. Yet it is equally mistaken to ignore the environmental shock simply because the evidence is quiet. In regions where survival depends on a narrow band of warmth, the dimming of the sun can become a historical actor as real as any king. The silence of northern evidence therefore speaks in a different register. It does not offer the dramatic sentence of a historian describing a pale sun. It offers absence, compression, and change. A farm abandoned, a treasure buried, a grave furnished differently, a hall no longer used, a mythic memory of winter. Each clue is incomplete, and each can be interpreted in more than one way. Together they suggest that the year the world went dark reached beyond the literate centres of empire into landscapes where the sky's failure became a question of whether a community could remain where it had always lived. Under the weak sun, the north does not merely suffer weather. It begins in some places to rearrange itself. When disaster lasts long enough, it begins to leave the realm of event and enter the realm of story. A darkened sun, a failed harvest, a winter that feels too long, a sickness that empties houses, a landscape where farms fall silent. These things do not remain only in accounts, graves, and tree rings. They pass into memory, and memory rarely preserves the past as a clean record. It reshapes fear into image. It gives suffering a pattern. It turns weather into warning, famine into moral lesson, and survival into sacred history. In the generations after the mid-6th century crisis, the people who endure the cold and hunger do not necessarily speak of volcanic aerosols or climatic forcing, but they may speak of a world whose order has trembled. What survives in later myth and legend cannot be treated as a direct transcript of 536, yet it may preserve something of the emotional weather that followed the year the world went dark. In northern traditions, especially later stories of cosmic winter, have drawn attention because they seem to echo the kind of crisis a darkened sun could produce. The idea of a terrible winter before a final upheaval, a season of cold without ordinary relief, belongs to a mythic imagination rather than a chronicle. It is not a weather report. It is shaped by oral transmission, poetic structure, religious change, later medieval writing, and centuries of reinterpretation. Scholars still debate whether memories of the 6th century cooling contributed to these motifs. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for the development of such powerful myths. Yet the possibility remains haunting. A society that has seen the sun, weakened crops fail, and farms abandoned may carry forward a deep memory of cosmic insecurity, even when the original dates and causes disappear. Myth works differently from history. History asks what happened, when, where, and with what evidence. Myth asks what an experience means when ordinary explanation fails. If the sun weakens for months, if cold breaks the confidence of summer, if animals die, and people move away from ancestral land, the crisis becomes larger than weather. It touches the structure of the world as people understand it. In societies where the sun is not simply a physical object, but a sign of order, fertility, divine rhythm, or cosmic balance, its dimming can feel like a wound in reality. Later stories may magnify that feeling into images of devouring wolves, endless winters, broken bonds, or the approach of an ending. These images are not scientific descriptions, but they may reveal how catastrophe feels from within. The same process can occur in Christian traditions, though in different language. In the Mediterranean and Near Eastern worlds, strange skies, famine, war, and plague are often interpreted through frameworks of divine judgment, repentance, sin prophecy, and providence. A dim sun may be understood as a sign rather than as a mechanical atmospheric effect. Disease may become a trial, a warning, or a mystery of God's will. Famine may be tied to moral failure, political corruption, or the spiritual condition of the people. Modern analysis separates eruption, cooling, crop stress, and plague into different categories, but 6th century observers often experience them as part of a meaningful pattern. Their explanations are not modern science, but they are not meaningless. They show how people try to make suffering intelligible when the causes are beyond reach. There is a danger, however, in reading every myth as hidden climate history. Not every tale of winter comes from one winter. Not every image of darkness comes from a volcanic veil. Human beings everywhere know night, cold, hunger, and fear. Mythic language can arise from many sources: seasonal cycles, ritual, symbolism, political trauma, migration, war, religious teaching, and the universal fact of mortality. The events around 536 may have intensified certain themes, but they did not invent the human imagination. Responsible storytelling must keep that boundary clear. It can say that later myths may preserve echoes of crisis. It cannot say that a specific myth proves a specific eruption. The past often leaves resonances, not signatures. Even so, the idea of echo matters. A catastrophe that is not fully understood in its own time may survive as tone. It may become a cultural memory of bad years, a sense that the world once turned cold and uncertain. In oral societies, memory is not stored as a list of dates. It is stored in genealogies, ritual warnings, origin tales, heroic cycles, place names, taboos, and images powerful enough to be remembered. A community might forget the exact year a farm was abandoned, but remember that the ancestors lived through a great hardship. A people might forget a sequence of cold summers, but preserve a story of a time when the sun failed. What survives in the record suggests that the 6th century crisis was severe enough in some regions to leave marks beyond immediate survival. The human mind also compresses prolonged disaster. Several years of cold hunger and sickness may later become one terrible winter, one cursed rain, one age of signs, one generation of loss. This compression is not simple error. It is how memory makes long-suffering narratable. A crisis that drags on through repeated harvest failures does not have a clean shape while it is happening. It is exhausting, repetitive, and uncertain. Later storytelling gives it form. It turns duration into symbol. The pale sun becomes darkness. The sequence of cold years becomes the great winter. The scattering of families becomes the age of wandering. The dead become ancestors of a changed world. In some places, material culture may preserve symbolic responses more directly. Deposits of precious objects, changes in burial practice, and ritual landscapes may reflect attempts to negotiate with forces beyond human control. The interpretation is difficult. Archaeology shows action but not always motive. A hoard may be hidden for safety or offered to gods. A burial custom may change because of belief status, migration, or imitation. A settlement may be abandoned because of climate conflict, disease, politics, or a combination. Yet during a period of sky-darkening and cooling ritual behavior becomes an important part of the human response. People do not only adapt materially, they also act symbolically. They make offerings, processions, prayers, fasts, vows, accusations, reforms, and stories. The unseen cause of disaster invites visible acts of meaning. This symbolic response is not a weakness of ancient people. Modern societies also turn disaster into narrative. Volcanic eruptions, pandemics, droughts, and strange skies still produce rumor, blame, speculation, political conflict, spiritual searching, and popular myth-making. The difference is that modern people also have satellites, laboratories, global communication, and scientific institutions. The 6th century world has none of those tools. Its explanations arise from inherited systems of meaning, and those systems shape how communities endure. A famine explained as divine warning may lead to repentance, charity, scapegoating, reform, or fear. A cold crisis explained through cosmic struggle may strengthen ritual practices or elite authority. Meaning has consequences. The year the world went dark therefore lives 2 lives. One belongs to physical history, eruption, aerosol, cooling, tree rings, ice cause, harvest failure. The other belongs to human memory, omen, punishment, cosmic winter, fearful sky stories told after the witnesses are gone. These lives overlap but do not fully merge. A volcanic particle and a mythic image are not the same kind of evidence, yet both can emerge from the same crisis. One tells how sunlight was reduced. The other tells how people tried to understand a world that suddenly felt less secure. By the time the darkness becomes legend, its original cause is lost to those who inherit the stories. The mountain remains unnamed. The chemistry is unread. The ice cores wait in silence. but something of the shock may remain in the cultural imagination, the sense that the sun can weaken, that winter can overstay its bounds, that order can fail from above, that human life depends on forces too large to command. This is the legacy of catastrophe in memory. It does not preserve facts with the precision of science, but it preserves fear, awe, and warning. And in the long aftermath of 536, those warnings become part of the fragile bridge between lived disaster and remembered time. Survival begins before anyone knows they are living through history. It begins in small decisions made without certainty, in the ordinary intelligence of people who cannot explain the sky, but still have to plant, cook, mend, bargain, pray, travel, and keep children alive. The year the world went dark can seem enormous when viewed through ice cores and imperial chronicles, but its human reality is made of practical acts under pressure. A family measures grain more carefully. A farmer shifts planting if the soil remains cold. A herder slaughters one animal to preserve others. A village repairs storage pits, watches strangers with caution, shares tools, hides food, or sends young adults toward better land. Survival is not dramatic in the way collapse is dramatic. It is repetitive, local, and often invisible. Yet without it, there would be no later world to remember the darkness at all. Communities in the 6th century inherit many forms of resilience. They are vulnerable to climate, but they are not passive. Farmers know more about local soils and seasons than any distant official. They understand which fields drain first, which slopes warm earlier, which grains are safer in difficult weather, which animals can endure poor fodder, and which wild foods might help during scarcity. Much of this knowledge never enters written records because it belongs to hands, habits, and household memory. A chronicler may write that famine occurs, but he rarely records the 1,000 adjustments made before famine becomes undeniable. What survives in the record suggests hardship. What mostly disappears is the labour of adaptation that stands between hardship and death. Food storage is one of the oldest defences against uncertainty. Grain kept dry and guarded can carry a household through bad months. Smoked, salted, dried, fermented, or otherwise preserved foods extend the reach of harvest beyond the season of plenty. In some regions, nuts, legumes, fish, cheese, oil, wine, and dried fruits add layers to survival. Wealthier estates and religious institutions may hold larger stores, and these reserves can become sources of charity control or conflict. Storage is never neutral in a hungry world. Whoever controls stored food controls time. A granary can save lives, but it can also sharpen inequality if access depends on status, debt, patronage, or force. During prolonged crisis, the question is not only whether food exists, but who can reach it. Trade offers another defense, though an uncertain one. If one region fails and another produces surplus ships, carts, pack animals, and merchants can move food across distance. The Mediterranean is built around this possibility. So are river systems, caravan routes, coastal exchanges, and local markets across Eurasia. But trade depends on surplus somewhere, safety along routes functioning currency, or barter and confidence that goods will arrive. In a widespread climate disturbance, the normal logic weakens. A merchant cannot buy grain from a region that has none to sell. A ship may carry food, but also disease. A ruler may requisition supplies before they reach the market. Prices may rise beyond what the poor can pay. Trade can soften disaster, but it can also reveal how connected scarcity has become. Migration is one of the most difficult forms of adaptation because it means abandoning the familiar. People moved for many reasons in late antiquity: war work, marriage, land, patronage, trade, exile, slavery, pilgrimage, military service, and opportunity. Climate stress adds another pressure. A family may leave marginal farmland after repeated failures. A herding group may shift routes in search of pasture. Workers may move towards cities, estates, monasteries, or regions rumoured to have food. Movement can save lives, but it also carries danger. Travellers face hunger, violence, debt exposure and suspicion. Communities receiving newcomers may see them as labour dependents, rivals or threats. The evidence remains incomplete, and it is rarely possible to trace one family's movement from the dark years, but settlement change in vulnerable regions suggests that some people survived by leaving places where old life could no longer be maintained. Religious institutions play a complex role in survival. Churches, monasteries, temples, shrines, and local holy places are not only centres of belief, they are also social structures with land storage networks, authority and obligations. In Christian regions, bishops and monasteries may organise charity, distribute food, shelter the vulnerable, or interpret disaster through sermons, fasts, processions, and repentance. These acts can provide real help, but they also shape meaning. A hungry population does not only need calories, it needs a way to understand why the world feels broken and what should be done next. Religious responses can comfort, organise, and mobilise. They can also intensify fear or blame. No single explanation fully accounts for how communities respond spiritually, but the crisis shows that survival is never only material. Political adaptation is harsher. Rulers and local elites must decide whether to remit taxes, demand them more aggressively, redistribute stores, requisition supplies, control prices, move armies, negotiate peace, or continue costly ambitions. Some decisions help, others deepen suffering. The poor often experience the state as an obligation before they experience it as protection. Yet a functioning authority can also prevent chaos by coordinating supply, protecting routes and restraining violence. The Byzantine Empire's administrative sophistication gives it tools that smaller communities lack, but those tools depend on the same weakened population and harvests. In crisis, power becomes both necessary and resented. A tax collector arriving after a failed harvest may represent imperial continuity to the palace and cruelty to the village. A lesser-known form of adaptation lies in changing what counts as acceptable food. Famine diets are often invisible in grand histories, but they are central to survival. People may rely more heavily on wild plants, roots, bark, acorns, seaweed, shellfish, small animals, or foods normally considered low status or emergency fare. They may stretch grain with fillers, reduce brewing, alter meal timing, or prioritize certain members of a household. These choices leave few clear traces unless preserved in texts or unusual archaeological remains. Yet they reveal the intelligence and pain of survival. Hunger changes culture at the level of taste and dignity. Foods avoided in normal times become necessary. The boundary between meal and medicine, nourishment and desperation begins to blur. Adaptation also involves memory. After a crisis, communities remember which choices helped. They may store more diversified crops, strengthen ties to patrons, abandon risky fields, build new alliances, or develop rituals around scarcity. A bad year can become instruction. Several bad years can reshape tradition. The generation that survives the mid-6th century may teach children caution in ways that later appear as custom rather than trauma. This is one reason disasters echo for so long. The atmosphere may clear, but behaviour changes remain. A people who have seen the sun fail may become less trusting of abundance. Not all adaptation is gentle. Crisis can intensify hierarchy. Those with land stores, weapon ships, or political office may gain power over those without them. Debt can turn free households into dependents. Food aid can bind people to patrons. Military leaders may rise where insecurity grows. In Northern Europe, some social transformations after the 6th century may reflect consolidation of power under stress, though scholars still debate the details. In imperial territories, landlords and officials may emerge stronger in some places even as populations weaken. Survival in this sense is not always equal. Some endure by absorbing the losses of others. A community may survive while becoming less free, yet it would be wrong to see only exploitation. Human beings also cooperate under terrible conditions. Kin share stores. Neighbours work fields for the sick. Religious houses feed strangers. Sailors risk voyages for profit and necessity. Local leaders organize defense or distribution. Parents go hungry for children. Craftspeople repair tools that keep food production alive. These acts are rarely named, but they are the hidden counterweight to catastrophe. The year the world went dark is frightening because it shows fragility, but it also shows persistence. The ancient world does not simply break beneath the dim sun. It bends, improvises, hardens, mourns, and continues. By the time the worst pressure eases in any given region, survival has already altered the survivors. Some are displaced, some are indebted. Some have lost family members to hunger or plague. Some have gained authority. Some have abandoned old farms. Some have learned that empires cannot guarantee sunlight, that gods may be invoked, but not commanded, that storage is life, that roads bring both rescue and danger. The crisis teaches lessons no one asks to learn. It leaves behind not only deaths and ruins, but habits of caution and new arrangements of power. The story of adaptation keeps the darkness from becoming only a tale of doom. It restores human agency without pretending that agency is limitless. People cannot clear the stratosphere. They cannot reverse volcanic winter. They cannot see bacteria or control the movements of fleas and rodents. But they can decide how to use the last grain, where to move the herd, whom to trust, when to leave, when to share, when to resist, and when to plant again. Beneath the pale sun, survival is made from those decisions. It is not enough to erase the suffering, but it is enough to carry history forward. The long shadow of 536 is difficult to measure because it falls across so many kinds of history at once. It belongs to climate history because ice and trees remember a severe disturbance. It belongs to political history because empires and kingdoms carry the strain of cold, hunger, war, and disease. It belongs to social history because ordinary households face choices that never appear in imperial monuments. It belongs to the history of memory because darkened skies and hard winters may echo in later stories. Yet it also belongs to the history of caution. The year has become famous not simply because the sun dimmed, but because it reminds modern observers that civilization rests on conditions so ordinary they are almost invisible until they fail. Warmth is one of them. Predictable seasons are another. A harvest that mostly arrives when expected is another. Remove those assumptions and the past begins to look less distant. Some historians and scientists have described the mid-6th century, especially the period beginning in 536, as one of the worst times to be alive in recorded history. The phrase is powerful, and it is easy to understand why. A darkened sun, volcanic cooling, crop failures. Famine notices, the Justinianic plague, imperial wars, and signs of disruption in northern societies create an extraordinary convergence. Few periods combine atmospheric shock and pandemic disease so dramatically in the surviving record. Yet the claim must be handled carefully. Human suffering cannot be ranked with perfect fairness across time. Other periods bring genocide, conquest, enslavement, megadrought, plague, war, displacement, and collapse on enormous scales. The evidence for 536 is striking but uneven. It is better to say that the mid-6th century appears to have been one of the most severe and far-reaching crisis periods of the last 2,000 years, especially across parts of the Northern Hemisphere, rather than turning it into a simple contest of misery. The reason 536 holds such fascination is that it joins the intimate and the planetary. A volcanic eruption may occur in a remote place, but its effects enter kitchens, barns, harbours, tax offices, monasteries and graves. A chemical signal in Greenland ice corresponds to a farmer staring at a field that will not ripen. A narrow tree ring corresponds to a household opening its stores too early. A dim sun described by a historian corresponds to ships sailing under strange light, and cities wondering whether the next grain shipment will arrive. This connection between scale and suffering is what gives the year its force. It shows that history is not only made by decisions humans understand, it is also made by processes they cannot see. For the Byzantine Empire, the long shadow appears in the gap between ambition and endurance. Justinian's reign remains monumental, but the world after him is not the restored Roman Mediterranean of imperial dreams. Italy is devastated by war. Plague returns in waves. Fiscal and military pressures continue. The empire survives, adapts and transforms, but its resources are not infinite. It would be misleading to blame the later transformation of the Eastern Roman world solely on the climate crisis or plague. The evidence remains incomplete, and many forces shape the centuries that follow war with Persia: internal religious disputes, administrative burdens, regional inequalities, and eventually the rise of Islam in the 7th century. Still, the mid-6th century shocks weaken the world in which those later events unfold. They do not write the whole script, but they change the stage. For Persia too, the picture is complex. The Sasanian Empire remains formidable after the dark years, capable of major military campaigns and political action. It does not simply collapse because the sun dims, yet repeated warfare, ecological pressure and disease may have contributed to long-term strains. The Roman-Persian rivalry consumes both empires heavily in the generations after Justinian, especially in the great wars of the early 7th century. By then, the crisis of 536 is no longer a fresh event, but its demographic, fiscal and environmental after-effects may still be part of a broader weakening. Scholars still debate how far that influence reaches. The danger lies in drawing lines too straight. The truth is more like a net, many threads under tension, some visible, some hidden, some snapping only later. In Northern Europe, the long shadow may appear in settlement change and cultural transformation. If parts of Scandinavia suffer severe disruption, then the consequences could include depopulation in some areas, consolidation of power in others, and shifts in ritual or elite identity. Later centuries see the development of societies that eventually enter the Viking Age, but it would be careless to claim a direct and simple path from 536 to Viking expansion. History does not work with such neat levers, yet crisis can reshape social landscapes in ways that become foundations for later change. A deserted farm, a stronger chieftain, a new dependency, a remembered winter, a ritual deposit of gold, a lineage that survives while another disappears. These are small alterations that can accumulate across centuries. One lesser-known legacy of the crisis is methodological. The study of 536 has changed because historians, archaeologists, climatologists, volcanologists, dendrochronologists and geneticists have learned to speak across disciplines. A medieval text alone cannot explain the event. An ice core alone cannot describe human fear. A tree ring alone cannot name an empire. Ancient DNA can identify plague bacteria in bodies, but it cannot describe the social meaning of an outbreak. Archaeology can show abandonment, but not always the reason. The power of the subject lies in bringing these partial records together without forcing them into a false certainty. The year becomes a model for how the deep past can be reconstructed from fragments that were never meant to meet. This interdisciplinary view also changes how collapse is understood. Older stories often imagine civilizations falling because of moral weakness, invasion, bad rulers, or sudden catastrophe. Modern scholarship tends to see collapse and transformation as processes with climate, disease, economics, politics, belief, and human choice interacting. The mid-6th century fits this better than it fits an old-fashioned collapse narrative. The world does not end. The Byzantine Empire does not vanish. Persia does not fall immediately. Northern Europe does not become empty. China continues through division toward eventual reunification. People adapt everywhere. Yet the crisis still matters profoundly, because survival under stress can produce a different world from the one that existed before. Collapse is not always disappearance. Sometimes it is continuity under altered terms. The long shadow also reaches into modern imagination because a dimmed sun feels both ancient and strangely possible. Volcanic eruptions still happen. Aerosols still affect climate. Food systems remain vulnerable even with modern technology because they depend on weather transport, energy politics, and trust. Pandemics still move through connection. Disasters still combine in ways that defeat simple planning. The year 536 is not a prophecy, and it should not be turned into easy alarm. But it is a warning from the past about complexity. It shows that societies are often prepared for familiar problems and less prepared for several unfamiliar pressures arriving together. The true terror of the year is not only darkness, it is convergence. That convergence explains why the phrase "the world went dark" continues to resonate. The darkness is literal enough to be grounded in evidence, but symbolic enough to contain famine, plague, fear, and uncertainty. It describes a sky and a condition. People could still see, but they could not see clearly what was happening to them. Their world remained visible, yet its rules had changed. The sun rose, but not as expected. Empires ruled, but less securely. Fields grew, but less reliably. Trade continued, but with greater risk. Bodies lived, but with greater vulnerability. Darkness in this sense is not the absence of light. It is the loss of confidence in the light. By the time the climate begins to recover, the world has already absorbed the lesson. The atmosphere can wound civilization from above. A distant mountain can become a famine in a land that never hears its eruption. A bacterium can move through the same networks that carry wealth. A state can survive and still be weakened. A community can adapt and still be transformed. The long shadow of 536 is therefore not only a period of suffering behind us, it is a reminder that the foundations of human order are environmental as much as political. The sky is part of history. The harvest is part of empire. The smallest particles in the air can enter the largest stories humans tell about themselves. What the darkness change cannot be reduced to one ruined empire, one abandoned village, one plague wave, or one winter remembered in story. Its meaning lies in the way it joins all of these without fully belonging to any single one. The year 536 begins as a strange atmospheric event, a dimming of daylight that unsettles observers and weakens growing seasons. But the change does not remain in the sky. It travels downward into soil food, movement, power, ritual, disease, and memory. By the time the crisis has passed into later centuries, the people who lived through it are gone, but the pattern remains. A world can be altered by causes almost no one understands while they are happening. The sun returns, yet the old certainty does not return with it. The most immediate change is the exposure of dependence. Ancient societies understand weather well in a practical sense. Farmers know seasons, sailors know winds, herders know pasture, builders know frost and rain, and officials know that taxes ultimately depend on production. Yet the crisis reveals a deeper dependence that no amount of skill can fully master. A farmer may know the best time to sow, but not how to respond when the sun itself weakens for months. A ruler may command provinces, but not the upper atmosphere. A city may store grain, but not enough for a world where several regions struggle at once. The darkness strips away the illusion that civilization stands apart from nature. It shows that law, empire, trade, and belief are all built beneath a sky that must remain generous enough for life to continue. This does not mean the ancient world is helpless. The story has shown the opposite. People adapt with intelligence and endurance. They store food, shift strategies, move across landscapes, seek patrons, prey, trade, share, hoard, flee, rebuild and plant again. States reorganize. Religious institutions respond. Communities remember. Some regions suffer severely, others less so. Some families vanish from the record, others survive and become ancestors of later worlds. The evidence remains incomplete, but it is clear that human beings do not meet catastrophe as empty victims. They respond within limits, and those limits matter as much as their courage. The darkness changes history partly by showing where those limits lie. It also changes the way the late antique world is understood. For a long time, historians explained major transformations through war politics, religion, migration, economics, and rulers. Those forces remain essential. Justinian's ambitions matter. Roman-Persian rivalry matters. Local elites matter. Theological conflict matters, trade and taxation matter. But the mid-6th century crisis forces another actor into the story: the climate system. Not climate as a vague background, but climate as an active pressure capable of intensifying existing problems and creating new ones. The year 536 does not replace human causes with natural ones. It entangles them. It reminds us that history is not made by humans alone, even though humans are the ones who suffer, interpret, and record it. The scientific reconstruction of the darkness has changed the past in another way. It has given silent evidence a voice. Ice cores become archives, tree rings become witnesses, tiny volcanic particles become historical clues. Human bones can preserve traces of plague. Settlement patterns can reveal stress where texts are absent. This does not make written records less valuable. It makes them part of a wider conversation. Procopius describing a dim sun, Irish annals preserving famine memory, Chinese sources noting abnormal cold Scandinavian archaeology, suggesting disruption, Greenland ice preserving sulfate in trees, recording narrow growth, all become fragments of one immense puzzle. No single fragment is enough. Together they create a history larger than any one civilization's memory. There is a strange humility in this kind of reconstruction. The people of the 6th century often looked for meaning in the sky, but the modern answer comes from places they never imagined as archives. A glacier becomes a historian. A tree becomes a chronicle. A speck of volcanic glass becomes a witness to a lost eruption. The cause of their fear may have been a mountain whose name they never heard in a land beyond their maps or beyond their surviving records. Their suffering was local, but its origin may have been planetary. This is one of the great lessons of the year. People can live at the center of their own world and still be affected by events far outside that world's knowledge. The darkness also changes memory because it refuses to stay in one category. It is a climate event but also a famine story. It is a volcanic mystery but also a plague-era prelude. It belongs to the study of late Rome but also to northern archaeology, East Asian records, and the history of environmental shock. It is dramatic enough for legend but grounded enough for science. Popular accounts sometimes make it sound like an apocalypse, and that goes too far. The world did not end. empires did not all fall at once. Humanity did not approach extinction. Many people continued their lives through it as people usually do. But reducing the drama does not reduce the importance. A disaster does not need to end the world to change it. What survives in the record suggests that 536 marks the opening of a period when many systems were forced closer to breaking. Food insecurity deepened. Disease found connected pathways. Political ambitions became harder to sustain. Northern communities may have reorganized under climatic stress. Stories of winter and cosmic disorder may have gained force. The crisis did not create every transformation that followed, but it helped shape the conditions in which later transformations became possible. It was not a single hammer blow. It was a weight added to structures already carrying strain. The most lasting change may be conceptual. The year teaches that the boundary between nature and history is false. A volcanic eruption is geological, but when its aerosols dim the sun, it becomes agricultural. When crops fail, it becomes economic. When hunger spreads, it becomes social. When rulers respond, it becomes political. When people search for meaning, it becomes religious. When later generations remember, it becomes myth. When scientists drill ice cores, it becomes data. The same event moves through every layer of human life-changing language as it goes. That is why 536 remains so compelling. It is one of the clearest examples of the planet writing itself into human history. By the end of the story, the world is not simply dark, it is revealed. Its connections become visible through stress. The farmer and the emperor, the tree and the glacier, the ship and the rat, the volcano and the granary, the myth and the measurement all belong to the same chain. The ancient world survives, but it survives altered. The sky clears, but the memory of its failure lingers. Somewhere far from the people who suffered most, the mountain that may have caused the darkness remains unnamed or uncertain. Yet its shadow passes through centuries. It rests in manuscripts, in ice, in abandoned ground, in narrowed rings, and in the modern imagination. The year the world went dark is therefore not only a story of catastrophe, it is a story of dependence, resilience, and incomplete knowledge. It shows how much can be changed by what cannot be seen, and how long it can take for evidence to gather itself into meaning. The people who lived beneath that pale sun did not know they were part of a climatic event that future scholars would debate. They knew the cold, the hunger, the fear, the rumours, the prayers, and the work still waiting in the fields. They lived inside the mystery. Centuries later, the mystery remains, but now it has shape, a dimmed sun, a wounded atmosphere, a strained world, and human beings continuing beneath a light they could no longer take for granted. After the darkness, the world does not return all at once. It softens gradually, unevenly, in places where fields begin to answer again, where trees widen their rings, where the sky resumes its ordinary brightness, without announcing that it has healed. The people who survive do not step out of catastrophe as if crossing a clear border. They carry it with them in habits, in caution, in missing names, in land left empty, and stories told beside hearths when winter comes too early, and the older ones remember that seasons can fail. The sun rises again with strength, but trust returns more slowly than light. The year 536 remains powerful because it shows how history can be changed by something almost weightless. Tiny particles high above the clouds dim the world below. A chemical veil becomes a cold field. A cold field becomes hunger. Hunger becomes movement, debt, prayer, violence, mercy, memory. The chain is long, and no one living inside it can see the whole length. A farmer sees the crop, a ruler sees the tax, a sailor sees the harbour, a sick family sees the doorway and the bed. Far away ice receives the falling trace of the same event in silence. Centuries pass. Empires change shape. Languages shift. The names of many who suffered disappear completely. Yet the year remains preserved in fragments that waited for patient hands, a line in a chronicle, a narrow ring inside old wood, a layer of sulfate sealed in as ice, a settlement that grows quiet, a mythic memory of winter and a weakened sun. None of these traces speaks alone with perfect certainty. Together they suggest a world briefly reminded of its fragility, a world that learns again that civilization is never separate from air soil, warmth, water animals, disease and time. The darkness did not end humanity. It did not erase every city or silence every road. People endured. They planted again. They buried the dead and fed the living. They repaired roofs, guarded grain, crossed seas, rebuilt walls, and told stories to make the fear bearable. That endurance is as important as the catastrophe itself. Beneath a pale and uncertain sky, life continued not grandly, not easily, but stubbornly, and somewhere in that lingering image the ancient world feels close, a field under dim light, a hand touching cold soil, a household listening for news, a sun behind a veil, and human beings waiting as they always have for warmth to return.